across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Good afternoon, this is Talk. I'm Peter Cardwell. Thank you so much for your company. There's loads to talk about this Thursday afternoon. I want to make sure you get your voice on the air because Keir Starmer has taken an axe, a chainsaw, some say, to the civil service. He's going to slash 9,500 jobs in NHS England. They'll mostly be pen pushers. So is that a good thing? And is getting rid of NHS England and reforming the NHS a good thing? It certainly needs reform, but is this the right reform? Let me know your thoughts on that. He says he's going to radically digitize the civil service using artificial intelligence. He's going to save £45 billion. Is it something that you think can actually happen, or is it perhaps a pipe dream? He says he's going to tackle the flabby state. Also, should farming subsidies stop? A minister has suggested that. What do you think of that? Maybe you're a farmer, maybe you're someone who knows a lot about farming. Should those subsidies stop? Apparently 40% of farmers' income in this country comes from farming subsidies, which will be axed in 2027. Obviously a legacy of Brexit. We're also talking about terrorism because the terrorism watchdog has rejected plans to expand the laws on terror after the Southport attacks. What actually is terrorism? What constitutes terrorism? We'll talk about that. We'll talk about Trump and Ukraine as well. Also Syria. Loads of people, loads of media are ignoring the fact that there are huge problems in Syria after Bashar al-Assad went a few months ago. People thought, oh, it's wonderful. We'll get these new guys, this HTS coalition in, and they'll be wonderful. Well, actually, no. Thousands of people are dead. They're killing them. There are many Christians who are dead as well. Why did the media ignore these stories? Well, we're not ignoring it here at Talk, so you can get your point on that across. And Damascus has been hit by Israeli airstrikes as well. We'll talk about the sport as the show goes on. We'll talk as well about to Jonathan Sacerdoti, who is a Jewish journalist, and he was going to give a talk at a school founded by a Nazi refugee about his view on the Middle East and all the rest of it. Well, it's been cancelled by the school. Why has it been cancelled? Because it might upset some people. There might be some sensitivity thoughts about this. We don't want anything that would challenge people or, I don't know, take them out of their comfort zone or make them think things that they may not have thought already. We'll have that story a little bit later on. We'll talk to Jonathan about that. Well, we are the home of free speech. We welcome all views, wherever they come from, whether you think I'm talking absolute rubbish or whether you think I'm talking pure sense. We want some common sense from you, certainly, because we are the home of common sense. And the number to call, 0344 499 1000. Faith is on the phone today. If you've never done it before, you make your point quickly to Faith, and then we ring you back between now and the end of the show at 7 o'clock. We'll get as many voices on the air as we can. 0344 499 1000. That's the main number for phone calls. You can also send me a voice note on that number as well. Keep them to less than a minute, please, and we'll play those out. And then you can also send me a WhatsApp text message on that number. You can text me 87222 with the word talk in your text. You can tweet me at talkTV or follow me at Peter Cardwell. Let's spend the next few hours together here on Talk. Well, there's lots happening with the NHS because the Prime Minister has made a speech today. He says there's no return to austerity. He says, I've not known a moment like this where the international instability is having such a direct effect on what happens back at home. And he's saying that NHS England is to be abolished. This is the body that runs the NHS. He is saying, in England, of course, and he's saying that actually it's going to be brought back under government control. We'll have the Health Secretary and him as Prime Minister directly responsible for what goes on. He says, I believe in the power of government, but the state is weaker than ever. Why is that? Well, that's because they farm them out to all these groups, these Quangos, which of course stands for quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisations, with appointed people who have very little accountability. And then we go to the government and say, actually, why is this not working? They say, well, it's the Quangos' fault. But he says there can be £45 billion worth of savings. Well, is that realistic? What do you think? 0344 499 1000. Lord McKinley, Craig McKinley, is with me now. He's a Conservative member of the House of Lords. Craig, thank you for joining me today. Do you think that Starmer can tackle our flabby state? Do you think this is realistic from Keir Starmer?
I think it's a great ambition. It's something I would obviously have promoted forever and for many years. But I mean, the biggest quango in the world is the NHS and NHS England. So I'm very pleased actually he's taking this step. And you know, perversely, sometimes big changes to the NHS, because it's become such a big politicised beast, it's being treated as a political football, that it can only be Labour that can actually address some of these problems perversely. And you know, I'll give them credit where credit is due if they manage to get something better out of this, you know, this monstrous thing that has had more money thrown at it over the last few years than any other department, and yet since the pandemic has managed to have an 18% reduction in productivity. I mean, that takes some doing. But you know, realistically, we've made the NHS political. I rather wish it wasn't, but it has been a ridiculous situation that secretaries of state or health ministers get berated for problems in some part of the health system, often on the floor of the House of Commons, and yet they have completely no control over what they're being berated and condemned for. So if we want to politicise NHS, which it seems that Labour obviously does, I think there could be a better way. But if we are going to have that, then it has to be under democratic political control. So from that point of view, it has to be. And I will certainly not be shedding a tear over NHS England closing its door finally. And that power, I hope, finding its way down to the ICBs more locally. So, yes, I think it's a step in the right direction. But do I think he'll achieve it with the unions on his back? No, I don't, because they'll start being restive. There'll be strikes and all the rest of it. We see it under Labour. We've sort of saw it already at the start of their tenure, and they just give in to the unions and throw a lot more money.
Well, it's really interesting you mentioned that about the unions, because look, I take absolutely no pleasure in 9,500 people who are apparently going to lose their jobs in NHS England. I lost my job 3 times before I was 30. It's a painful process. It's not nice. I don't wish it on my worst enemy. But if those people are the flabby state, and if those jobs aren't needed, well then how tough do you think Keir Starmer can be with the unions? And I'm very interested secondarily in the point you made about only Labour is actually able to do this. I wonder whether the Conservatives they talked a good game on this, but there just wasn't the political bandwidth really to make such changes because of so many criticisms, of course, of the Conservatives over the NHS saying they want to privatise it, they want to sell it to America, none of which there was ever any evidence for.
No, well, the truth is that under Tony Blair, there was more, what you might call privatisation or outsourcing of services to private sector to deliver, often more efficiently, cheaper, and actually treating patients decently. But let's put that aside. But no, Tony Blair did more of that than the Conservatives ever have, because it's been so politicised, and we hear all that nonsense before every election. 24 hours to save the NHS, yes. 12 hours. So, you can read it way back to the 80s and probably even further back than that. But yes, I rather wish it wasn't politicised. I mean, I can't imagine that in Germany or in France or Spain or I know Medicare had quite a run under the Obama years, but generally in countries, health systems are not at the forefront of politics. But we've created that in this country. Opposition parties make people fearful over it, and so we are where we are. But I don't know if it was even a secret, but there was discussion some months before the election that we were wishing to and sort of semi-planning to do similar with the NHS England.
Will it change things, Craig?
We ran out of steam.
Will it change things, Craig? Will we really see a major change in the NHS? Will waiting times get better? Will people be able to go into A&E and do things more quickly? Will they be able to get GPs appointments they haven't been able to previously? Because a lot of people might look at this and say, okay, fair enough, NHS England disappearing. Well, great, but does that actually add up to a hill of beans?
People in this country, they want to know that when they phone up their GP, they can get an appointment. They know that if they have to go to A&E, and it's rather too readily they have to go to A&E because there is no GP available, that's another issue. Yeah. But when they want some treatment, they want to know that it will be delivered quickly, decently, and to a high standard. Frankly, that is as far as most people want from their NHS. It is, as I say, it's become politicised. I can't imagine NHS England was standing in the way of good service, but it was certainly consuming.
It was another layer of bureaucracy, really, wasn't it? And those were the changes that your party made, that Andrew Lansley made. And I'm sure there are a number of people, Andrew Lansley, when he was Health Secretary just over 10 years ago, I'm sure there'll be a lot of people, perhaps even in the NHS as well, perhaps raising their eyebrows or rolling their eyes and saying, well, actually, this is just another, moving the deck chairs, and will this actually change things, I suppose? Let's hear a bit from Keir Starmer, because he made the speech earlier in Yorkshire on abolishing NHS England. This is what Keir Starmer said earlier today.
The NHS should be taken by an arm's length body, NHS England. And I can't, in all honesty, explain to the British people why they should spend their money on 2 layers of bureaucracy. That money could and should be spent on nurses, doctors, operation, GP appointments. So today I can announce we're going to cut bureaucracy across the state, focus government on the priorities of working people, shift money to the front line. So I'm bringing management of the NHS back into democratic control by abolishing the arm's length body NHS England. That will put the NHS back at the heart of government where it belongs, freeing it to focus on patients, less bureaucracy, with more money for nurses, an NHS refocused on cutting waiting times at your hospital.
That was Keir Starmer speaking earlier on. Craig, what did you make of that language and those words from Keir Starmer?
Well, I doubt as we're going to see the Argentine President Millei's chainsaw. It's probably more like some nail clippers, probably.
Yes, perhaps slightly blunt nail clippers.
That's the sadness of it. But no, I mean, he made some bold speech there. I suppose the only downside, I mean, it almost runs contrary to what I've said. I do think these things should be under democratic political control, but the flip side of that, of course, is that governments can generally not even run a bath. So for them running a health service is not a great prospect either. But if we're going to get held accountable, I mean, I remember being in the House of Commons, and usually a Lib Dem, strange enough, would be berating the Health Secretary because Mrs. Miggins in their constituency had been waiting 3 hours for an ambulance. And you think, well, hold on, there is an ambulance trust there somewhere with a very well-paid chief executive, a very well-paid board and finance director. It is the responsibility of them, not the responsibility of the Health Secretary. If you want the Health Secretary and Health Ministers to be responsible, you have to have this type of arrangement, which it seems Sir Keir is alluding to.
Indeed, and actually, if you look at the Ministry of Justice, for example, where I worked as a special advisor, you have a structure where you can draw a line from a prison officer right up to the Secretary of State for Justice, to the Lord Chancellor. There are various bodies in between, like Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service and so on, but there is a clear line between those, and that accountability is there, and that's a very, very important thing, I think. So I think this is probably not a bad idea. I just wonder how much of a fight you think he has on his hands. We talked about the unions a little bit earlier on, certainly in regard to the health service, but and other public bodies as well. I mean, getting rid of 9,500 civil servants isn't going to be easy, is it, Craig?
No, but I think we should see this as an opportunity, not just for the country's finances, but for those people who will or may be losing their jobs. These, I hope, are skilled people. I'm sure most of them are. And if they have skills, they will be able to be put to good use somewhere else in this great country of ours. And if it's productive work, then so much the better. Do you know what? I think it could be good both ways. So let's not see it as negative job losses. This could be a positive liberation of people's skills to actually do some other things. So all in all, a very good thing. So, we shouldn't really be crying when we lose what I would call, jobs that actually don't produce anything. We should actually be rejoicing that these people are liberated to do work that might actually be productive for the economy, and I hope that is the case. And it is a reduction in the public purse, because we've now got hundreds of thousands of additional civil servants through the system than we had pre-COVID. And you just asked the question why, because the country was managing, it was ticking along. I'm a chartered accountant in normal life, and I've never seen HMRC in such a bad state. My record of a letter of response from HMRC is 13 months.
That's quite impressive.
Frankly, you cannot run a modern economy with a very complex tax system with 13-month turnarounds of letters. We've got to do better than that.
I know someone who owns a small business. They were there was a change to how money came into the company. They explained that to HMRC in a 1-minute phone call, which explained it. It was explained to me, and it was very straightforward. HMRC launched an investigation. It took a year, and it ended up that that person owed HMRC something like £320. And of course, the accountant's fees were about 10 times that. So yeah.
Well, of course, they will be. I mean, the other side of that, of course, we're not discussing here is the whole working from home dynamic, but that's a discussion.
It's a whole other issue.
Of its own.
Well, Craig, thank you. Really appreciate that. That's Lord McKinley, Craig McKinley, who's a Conservative member of the House of Lords. What do you think of all of this? 0344 499 1000. We've had some reaction from Brian on the Syria story as well, saying Lamy directly funded those Syrian terrorists. He must be held accountable. I think what Brian is referring to is the £50 million of your money, taxpayers' money, that's been given to HTS, which is the organisation that is the regime, essentially, that is running Syria. We know they have been involved in killing their enemies, including Christians. We're going to talk about that a bit later in the programme. It doesn't suit the usual narrative of many in the mainstream media. We're going to talk about it in a way that they haven't a little bit later on in the programme. We're also going to continue to talk about the NHS and its reform and what you think of all of that. We're going to talk to Martin Gower, in fact, a former NHS Trust Chair, in just a minute, and also Paul in Leicester. But stay with us here on Talk.
People are suckered in by the label on the tin that might say hate. We're cracking down on hate or racism or sexism, and they don't actually open up that tin to see what that label actually is covering. So, for example, is mispronouncing somebody's name hate and racism, or is it just an innocent mistake? Well, again, these are the kinds of subtleties that those police officers will miss because they just buy whatever it is that is in the name of that label.
Yeah.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Thank you to Mike in Lincoln, who sent me a WhatsApp text message to say, "Afternoon, Peter. Quangos are just a way for those elected to make decisions to avoid making those decisions. They've become a substitute for the EU, as in the politicians we elect claim it's too difficult to do it because of the EU, or now a Quango. Look at how useless and politicised some like Ofcom, Ofwat, Ofgem, and indeed the Sentencing Council are. Time to close the Quangos and bring power back to government," says Mike. Well, Mike, are you saying that Keir Starmer's done the right thing with NHS England, which I think is the biggest Quango in the world, but now, of course, it is a Quangon. Thank you to Massimo from Great Bowden, who says, "Great to see you. through the screen, says Massimo, with all the speculation of an estimated 300,000 jobs across this Parliament and the prospect of a further 9,500 job cuts from the public sector and the push to get people off disability benefits and back into work. Where are all these jobs going to come from? It's a little concerning, don't you think? Yes, I do, Massimo. I think that's a really, really good point, and I wonder, where does the growth actually come from? Paul is in Leicester and has some thoughts on the civil service. He's given me a ring on 0344 499 1000. Paul, you're welcome to the programme. What would you like to say? Hello.
Hello, Peter. I think it's the civil service has gone too far. I think it used to, back in the day, the 90s, the 80s, even the 70s, it used to be a really good job, apparently, and everybody was proud of what they were. I've never worked for them, but proud of what they did, and they've got a really good pension, retired young. I think it's far too politicised now, and I think you may be able to tell me how it works. What happens in America? They kind of pick their own, don't they, at the top?
Well, they're very politicised. They're very politicised, Paul, because they, if it's a Republican administration, as it is at the moment, well, all the civil service are Republicans. Do you think that should happen in this country? I think it should be, because there's no smoke without fire. Over the years, we've gone through all the things, the Dominic Raab thing, and they never get spoken about, and it all goes in the cover. They never get named. It goes both ways, though, Paul, doesn't it? I mean, would you be happy for a Labour government to choose thousands of its own appointees as civil servants?
Well, this is it, and so you just think good point. Because I'd never.
I mean, I think
Labour, and I never would.
Well, I worked for 3.5 years with civil servants, and I can honestly say the vast majority of them were impartial people, and I think the civil service gets a bit of a bad rep sometimes. But there is a lot of it is just sort of institutional resistance to change, because things just take such a long time to do, as they do in any large organisation usually.
From what I could see, it's permanent secretaries. Not many of them have a lot of power.
They do.
That's what I can see. Now, whether they ought to be, they should come in with each government, whatever, so they can get the right people in there.
Well, Dominic Cummings certainly got rid of quite a few of them when, I think there were 4 of them he got rid of when he was Boris Johnson's chief advisor. But some interesting thoughts there, Paul. Thank you for that. That's Paul. Cheers, mate. Thank you. That's Paul in Leicester. Let's get some more interesting thoughts from Martin Gower. He is a former NHS Trust chair. Martin, what do you make of this, and what do you make of NHS England as a body? Has it worked over the last decade or so?
Almost certainly not. I mean, my direct experience was that it just slowed things down. My last trust, we were involved in an acquisition merger with another trust. Patently obvious thing to do it. It wasn't, it wasn't very challenging, the decision. But it took 2 years to achieve something that could have been done in 6 months. And it was largely because of NHS England wanting us to get consultants in, wanting us to check this, keep on feeding back ever more data. So I don't think it was successful, and I don't actually blame the fact that it was there, more the people who managed it, who I think were just, frankly, old-fashioned bureaucrats who were there, for every one person who could say yes, there were about 30 who could say no, and it just slowed everything down. I mean, today, I've campaigned, I go and give talks about the NHS, and I've campaigned to decommission the NHS England. But my problem with it is, if they just transport a lot of those people into the Department of Health, it's just winding the clock back, really. We used to have strategic health authorities, before that area health authorities and regional health authorities, all branches of the DOH as it was in those days. And then they took a lot of those people out, turned it into NHS England, headed it up with the same guy, a guy called David Nicholson, who was in charge of it. And frankly, it didn't make an enormous amount of difference. And my problem with this is that politically, it may sound like a really bold step that Keir Starmer is taking. I'm not actually sure that it is.
I mean, he's getting rid of a sizable bureaucracy. He's saying that 9,500 people will lose their jobs. Won't that help in some way? I don't want anybody to lose their job, by the way. I take no joy in that. But will that not make a more efficient, a leaner structure in terms of the bureaucracy of the NHS?
Yeah, I mean, you could have done that without necessarily abolishing NHS England. I mean, reducing the headcount of bureaucrats in the NHS is not that difficult, and actually very, very necessary at every level of the NHS. There are too many people pecking away on computer screens and not enough people fronting the patients in the NHS. and certainly not enough people who are involved in directly dealing with the patients. I think the other thing, Peter, is that is this going to be the beginning of proper integration of social care? It is the Department of Health and Social Care.
We've heard very little about that, haven't we, Martin? And that is, I remember someone very senior in the NHS saying to me a few years ago, said the NHS is on its knees, but social care has fallen over.
Yeah, it's the elephant in the room, and I'm not sure though that bringing it, what Keir Starmer said today was making it more democratic, bringing it closer to democracy. What he means is bringing it closer to politics. And if we look at the political achievements of the 39 secretaries of state we've had since the NHS was formed, they're not actually that great. You find out, look for who the good guys have been, and there's maybe 3 or 4 of them.
But at least there can be some level of accountability, Martin, rather than saying, actually, it's all Amanda Pritchard's fault or it's all NHS England's fault.
I believe that accountability should be local. There are many local NHS services which across the board are pretty good. Where I live in South Warwickshire, I have to say the Foundation Trust who run the hospital are pretty effective. Our GP services are good, often get appointments the same day, or all of those things. And people who do need care get it, and they get it pretty promptly. And it's because the integration of the services is done well. But that's nothing to do with what the Department of Health or Wes Streeting will do. It is to do with the local services. Sensibly getting together, collaborating, and delivering to the patients and the public at large.
Martin, thanks for your thoughts there. That's Martin Gower there, who is a former NHS Trust Chair. Appreciate him joining us today. Rob has been in touch and says NHS England, all Labour will do is change the name and move the existing workers over to it, and then claim they've taken back control. There are 15,300 workers, so even after the 9,000 going, there'll still be 6,300 left. What actually will they do? Nothing different to what they do now. The whole thing will result in more workers being employed in the end, and it will empire build like a Quango, top heavy with managers and accountable for nothing, says Rob. Well, James in Staffordshire has some thoughts on this. He's given me a ring. You can too. 0344 499 1000. James, what would you like to say?
Hello, Peter.
Hi there.
I just want to point out the reason why the NHS is a basket case is because they repeat the same things 220 times over. There's something like 220 trusts. Each has got a head of trust, an assistant head of trust, a deputy head of trust, a head of HR, a head of IT, and also the NHS doesn't bring its buying power to bear. One trust pays £20 for nitrile gloves that you'd pay a £5 for. And then, last point I want to make, most of the heads of trust are on more money than the Prime Minister.
Yeah, it's often the case. It's often the case. And you do wonder when you're running an organisation which is important, but not the country, why should be on such a huge amount of money? I mean, the Lady Chief Justice, for example, is on £330,000 a year, and you do wonder why these people need such huge salaries. Is there no one else available?
Yeah, I mean, I worked for the police for 20 years. They came up with the police and crime commissioners. When we were a police authority, the bill was around about 80,000 a year for the police authority members. When we got a PCC, that went up to 4.5 million.
Wow!
Because he had a deputy, he had an assistant, he had a media and marketing guy, and this, that, and the other.
And were things better, James? Were they better? Did he get 4.5 million quid's worth of value for the taxpayer out of the police and crime commissioner?
Well, I mean, I love it when vote for me, I'm against crime.
Yes. I'm not sure you're going to win if you're pro-crime, though, James.
No, but you understand what I mean. I mean, it's just another... It's like the mayors that they're trying to put in. I mean, if you take a look at Sadiq Khan...
I'd rather not, James.
Fist he's made of London and this, that and the other. And Labour like to bring in a new level of bureaucracy. I promise you...
In fairness, the Conservatives brought in quite a lot of it as well, and they said this is bringing local accountability. But like the NHS, I think, anyway, James, it just brings more and more layers of bureaucracy and not of accountability. I'd centralise everything, basically.
Oh, absolutely. And then, as I said, why can't the NHS bring its buying power to bear?
I think there's a bigger question as well, which is, does devolution work? Which I'm not sure it does, but that's perhaps for another day as well. James, thanks for your thoughts. That was James in Staffordshire. Oh, sorry, go ahead. James, you had a final point to make?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Two weeks ago, my wife dislocated her shoulder. Long story short, won't bother going into that. Went into A&E on a Sunday, and we went in the Sunday afternoon, and we had 11 hours, 12 hours until she got treated. When we were leaving, the queue was 12 hours. That's just to see somebody, because there were 2 doctors on and 2 nurses. They treat the weekends totally different.
Yeah. That's a big point as well. How's your wife now, James?
She's still living with me.
That's good. But how's her shoulder?
She's on the mend.
Good. Well, we wish her all the best. James, thank you. That's James in Staffordshire there. On farm subsidies, Terry's been in touch and says, what utter genius decided to stop subsidies to farmers? Yet another attack while we hear obesity is to be the NHS's biggest future problem. Correct me if I'm wrong. No, Terry, you're absolutely right. And farm subsidies, listen, farming is a big industry. It's important to have food security as well. We hear all about food security. We'll talk about that a little bit later on in the programme as well. We'll also answer the question next, what is terrorism and what should be called terrorism? This comes in the aftermath of Southport and a pretty damning report actually from the government's review of terrorism. We'll speak to a terrorism expert, Ian Aitchison. He is coming next on this. I want your views too on this story, 0344 499 1000.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
What is terrorism? What do you consider terrorism to be? And should the public have been given more information in the aftermath of the Southport attacks by Axel Raducabana? We know that the Jonathan Hall KC, who is the independent terrorism reviewer, says the near silence from authorities after such attacks, including Southport, is no longer an option in the social media age. He appeared to rubbish Sir Keir Starmer's defence that going public could have collapsed the trial. The question as well, I think, is what should terrorism actually be? What is the definition of terrorism? And should we call things like what Axel Raducabana did terrorism? Many people would say yes. Others would say it's a mass attack. It's something that actually didn't have a terrorism motivation. Well, he had an Al-Qaeda manual, training manual. So actually, what do we think about this, and where should the definition lie? No better person to talk to you about this than Ian Aitchison, who is the author of Screwed on the prisons. He is a prison service expert, having been a former governor. He's also a counter-terrorism expert. Ian, what do you think of what Jonathan Hall has said? It's not exactly pro Keir Starmer.
I agree with what Jonathan Hall has said. We already have a definition of terrorism in the Terrorism Act 2000, and that's the use or the threat of violence to further a political, religious, or ideological cause. So it's clear, and Jonathan Hall is saying that can't be expanded. Why is he saying it can't be expanded? Well, there's three things really that he was talking about that I agree with him on. So first of all, there's the risk of overreach. If you expand that definition, as the Prime Minister was suggesting, you might have lots of false positives, potentially prosecuting individuals who aren't terrorists and risking abuse of the anti-terror laws. You've got freedom of expression concerns. Widening the scope might, as he says, impose unacceptable restrictions on freedom of expression. So I think he used the example, Peter, of sharing violent content and being penalised for it without any actual terrorist intent. And the third thing is arguably the most important thing, and that is mission creep and resource strain. I mean, he argues that an expanded definition could overwhelm the police and the security services, diverting resources and attention from existing threats without adequate support. And that really is a big problem. If you look at, lots of incidents that fall into the terrorism definition or fall outside it, and actually Rudakabana is a very interesting example of a kind of neither fish nor fowl kind of offence. It was an atrocity. It had elements of terroristic behaviour, certainly. People were terrorised, children were murdered. Some of the offences he was charged with relate to terrorism, they're connected. Others weren't, in the absence of any clear, coherent ideology. But, as I've said to you before, the dead are just as dead. The problem is here, and it's been said before, if everything becomes extremism, nothing is. And we run a real danger of expanding that, mission creep, or that definition so much, it becomes impossible to police it.
Tell me your thoughts on what Jonathan Hall said about Southport itself, because there were so many people saying, just give us basic information in regard to Southport, all sorts of misinformation, but it came essentially from, well, many would argue that it came from the government, actually, the misinformation, not from other places. And actually, if people had just been levelled with and treated like adults in the first place, a lot of people think that actually maybe the riots wouldn't have happened, or maybe that level of anger wouldn't have happened. What do you think of that?
I agree pretty much with that. I mean, Jonathan and I were both on Panorama a couple of weeks ago, being interviewed about the Southport atrocity. And effectively, we said the same thing. The void of silence that happened after the attack was committed was probably motivated by the best of intentions, but that was a completely wrong-headed desire to maintain what the police would describe as community cohesion. And it's a paradox, really, that it had the absolute opposite effect. It allowed misinformation and disinformation to fill that gap. There were all sorts of things that were then propagated in social media immediately. Went round the world twice before the truth had its boots on, as the saying goes, about the fact he was a Muslim immigrant, I think, and various things like that. And I think the public were not treated properly. We're not treated in an adult way, and as Jonathan has said, we're not given immediate information, in a sober way that might have had the intent of shutting down some of the awful disturbances that we've seen. And in fact, I think it's worse than that in a way. And the public inquiry is likely to surface this. I think there was a deliberate attempt by Merseyside police to obfuscate some of the details about Rudakabana. That aggravated it.
Okay. Give me your thoughts on why you think that happened. What would, you're saying sometimes there were perhaps bad motivations that shouldn't have been correct. Was this in an experienced government? Was it a security service that was too cautious? What will have been the stages that will have gone through there from your expertise to say, actually, Prime Minister or whoever, or police service, this shouldn't be in the public domain?
Well, Peter, we're both from Northern Ireland. You know the expression, whatever you say nothing. I mean, I do think some of that was being deployed. It obviously, to be fair to Merseyside Police, it was a fast-moving and dynamic situation, but I think it was badly mishandled. And again, I suggest, in the misplaced interest of community cohesion, different aspects of characteristics that were known were left out, or open to misinterpretation, shall we say. And then that was, in the continuing void after the initial attack had happened, that was capitalized on by people who were saying, we're being taken for fools here. Here's the real story. Of course, all those allegations turned out to be false. But the rabbit was out of the hat, or the genie was out of the bottle long before then. And one of Jonathan's points he makes is that kind of response is obsolete in the age of social media, where you have instantaneous information and misinformation and willful disinformation going out about these attacks. If the police had said, as Jonathan had said, we don't believe that this attack is terrorist motivated immediately, and had they said some more about the characteristics of the perpetrator, it is arguable that a lot of the social unrest that did, completely unacceptable social unrest, by the way, that did emanate from that silence could have been stopped. And I hope some of that is discussed openly at the public inquiry. And I hope then the police get better advice on balancing public interest with the need to protect a dynamic and fast developing situation where they simply don't know all of the information straight away.
Will this be corrected, do you think, because of this? Will the mythical lessons be learned from in terms of the amount of information that was put in the public domain? Because had all the information, or some of it anyway, that what Jonathan Hall argues anyway actually wouldn't have prejudiced a trial because it's factual information, things might have been very different.
Well, I think you've got some cultural issues to tackle, not just inside police constabularies, but inside the Crown Prosecution Service. Merseyside Police were very quick to say we were constrained in what we could say because of issues relating to contempt of court, and we were being advised by the CPS and what we could and couldn't say. That obviously does need to change. But to your point, I'd be quite interested in an investigation that says, why do we never learn in relation to terrorist attacks lessons that should be learned? Because there's a history of repeated failure in relation to the management of and the prevention of terrorism and the prevention of extremism. That is a whole other aspect of what Jonathan Hall was saying. And he argues correctly, I think, and I've been arguing about it for years, for the creation of an independent resource that the police and possibly other protective agencies can be involved in, that is able to spot and stop and manage the risk of people who don't cross that threshold of terrorism, but are nevertheless extremely dangerous because they're intent on trying to create mass casualty attacks, which of course, the dead are just as dead no matter which side of this equation you stand on. The damage is just as awful and the consequences are just as severe to society. But it is a blind spot I think we have. Our defences are weak in that area. So I think it's quite right that we focus on creating structures and agencies that are able to look in that space to deal with people who represent that sort of risk.
Ian, thank you very much indeed. That is Ian Aitchison there. He is a counter-terrorism and prison safety expert. Simon's been in touch on the NHS story we're covering today, the scrapping of NHS England. It is not so much a Quango as a Quangon. Simon in Nafferton says, I think Sir Keir has been listening to Talk. Talk have been rightly rubbishing the NHS England forever. Good riddance to this awful organisation introduced by the wonderful Tories, lest we forget. Yes, it was Andrew Lansley who was the Health Secretary under David Cameron. Those huge changes that were there. Hi Peter, says Jimmer. He says, I work for an NHS ICB, which is an integrated care board, and we have today been told there will be 50% cuts here too on the back of the National Health and Social National NHSE cuts. My view for this has been that NHS England stand in the way of effective and efficient decision making, but at a local level. I'm concerned about the degree of cuts local commissioning services are facing and the effect this will have on local primary and secondary care services in delivering timely, cost-effective and clinically effective treatment. Thank you for that. Ernie says, hi Peter, here we go, the National Health Service, what's going to be controlled by the government? The police and courts are almost there. A pattern seems to be emerging. Well, there should be operational independence, I think, but nonetheless some accountability, Ernie, so I'm not entirely sure I agree with you. Over at the White House, we know that Mark Rutte, who is of course the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, he is going to be talking to President Trump, and we will talk about that. We'll also talk to our next guest, Steve Gill, who's a former advisor to the Clinton and Bush administration, about what President Trump is talking about in regard to Russia. Do you remember all those people who said, oh, he's a shill for Russia, all he does is say he's a plant for Russia, he's a Russian agent? Well, now he's threatened to devastate their economy. Maybe he actually is President Trump. Maybe he is someone who is an honest broker in all of this. Let me know your opinion on what happens next in Ukraine. 0344 499 1000, and indeed on all the tariffs that are going to be imposed, presumably on Europe in terms of European alcohol. I was watching the BBC News at 1 o'clock actually, and the newsreader said that the tariffs on alcohol would be on your EU, alcohol from the EU. That's things like wine and champagne. I really, really appreciated that clarification, because I wouldn't have known what on earth alcohol referred to previously. So thank you to them for that. Stay with us here on Talk.
People are suckered in by the label on the tin that might say hate. We're cracking down on hate or racism or sexism, and they don't actually open up that tin to see what that label actually is covering. So, for example, is mispronouncing somebody's name hate and racism, or is it just an innocent mistake? Well, again, these are the kinds of subtleties that those police officers will miss because they just buy whatever it is that is in the name of that label.
Yeah.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Thanks to quite a number of people who've actually been in touch about Cheltenham, the horse racing festival that's on today, and apparently in the 2 o'clock there was a horse called Caldwell Potter, and because it's Caldwell, it's a bit similar to my name, which is Cardwell. Marco has been in touch and said, just saw my first decent win at Cheltenham due to Peter Cardwell's name resembling Caldwell Potter. Cheers, Peter. And David says, I saw this horse racing today at Cheltenham. One of my very favourite radio presenters and top political commentator inspired my choice. It only went and won. Great price too. Well, I'm delighted to hear that. I was unaware of that. There was one called Rich Hill last year, which is the village that I'm from in Northern Ireland. I bet some money on it. Not that I bet on horse racing very often, and I think it's probably still running. So there we are. It certainly did not win. Let's talk to another place where bets are being placed. That is at the White House. Mark Rutte, who is the NATO Secretary General, he is due to meet Donald Trump very, very soon. We will see what happens there. Putin has agreed to the ceasefire under certain conditions, we're hearing, certainly, and we know that Yuri Yushakov, the Putin aide, had previously cast some doubt on all of that. Steve Gill is with us, a former advisor to the Clinton and Bush administrations. Steve, where are we with this, and where do you think Donald Trump will land? Because so many people have been so critical of him previously, saying, oh, he's such a shill for Putin. Oh, he's just saying everything. He's using the playbook of the Kremlin. He's saying everything Putin wants him to say. Well, he just threatened to devastate their economy if they don't agree to what he wants them to agree to. So I think we can look back on those lines and those criticisms and say, actually, hold on a second here. He had some sort of plan.
Well, first of all, Peter, you're regularly called a horse's posterior. I just know that you're not regularly called a horse's winner in the winner's circle.
I like it.
So
I like
maybe
it.
there is a better
by
connection.
You, Steve. By you.
I think people again need to go back and read The Art of the Deal and the threats that Trump is making towards Putin. The claims he made are all part of negotiation. Everything he does is part of a negotiation to get to an end result. The same way that we're looking at the UK and EU, he's threatening to destroy those economies with the tariffs, and you have Starmer and the EU saying, well, we just want reciprocity. It's like, well, at least you're using the right words, because that's what Trump is demanding. And when you have tariffs that are 3, 4, 5, 100% higher than the U.S., that's not reciprocity. So again, I think look to Trump, always look to what's the negotiation strategy, what's the end result, not where you are at the start.
Yes, it's a very, very good point. And if you look at what he said, I've said this a number of times, but what he said sort of 6 weeks ago in terms of peace in Ukraine, he's getting a lot closer to that deal. And similarly, defence spending, which has gone up in Russia, it's gone up in Germany, it's gone up in the United Kingdom. He gets what he wants eventually. What do you make of where things are in regard to the ceasefire, particularly, and what will be on the agenda for Mark Rutte and Donald Trump here meeting very, very soon?
I think the offer from Ukraine has been disregarded by Russia, and properly so. A 30-day timeout to rearm, to remove your troops, to try and kind of re-engage militarily in 30 days is not an end to the conflict. And I think what Trump wants, what most reasonable people want in Ukraine, in the Western Europe, and certainly in Russia, is to end this, which means you're going to have to do something more than just have Zelensky call the shots and say Russia has to completely evacuate Ukraine. And by the way, there are reports that the UK is now trying to establish a port in Odessa as part of the secret negotiations with Starmer and Zelensky. That is another bright red line to put NATO closer to and in direct military contact with Russia. That's going to be a no-go. So everything that's being done on the Ukraine side right now is looking to spark World War III rather than resolve this conflict.
Tell us a bit about Steve Witkoff, who is, of course, Donald Trump's envoy. He's in Moscow pitching this plan. Does he have the full confidence of Donald Trump? Is he someone who Putin could perhaps do some business with after he answers all of the questions that Putin has? He says he has many questions over the ceasefire deal.
I think you're using the right term. Can he do business with Putin? Mm-hmm. And I think that when you look to Donald Trump, whether it's the minerals deal in Ukraine that is conflicted by the fact that Keir Starmer and Zelensky have struck apparently a resources deal that's kind of part of the 100-year plan with the Brits. Is Zelensky selling the same stuff more than once to different parties? I mean, I think that's a real issue and a real matter of concern. But then what happens next if you're actually trying to move towards peace? And I think that President Trump and President Putin will talk very quickly about, removing the sanctions, getting business back. At a time that Trump is threatening the aluminum industry in Canada, you have Putin promising, hey, we'll sell you aluminum. So there's a lot of business to be done. And frankly, if U.S. business boots are on the ground in Ukraine, if U.S. business interests are resumed with Russia and in the Donbass, that's going to bring peace to the region a lot more than more military weapons and missiles and bombs.
Yes, and I wonder as well, really domestically, how this is going down. How much does the American public and the Republican Party and Congress more generally care about Ukraine and want a solution here? I know it's a huge issue here in the UK, but in America, presumably it's something that is talked about a lot. But the man and woman on Main Street, how much do they care about it, Steve?
Well, Peter, as you guys are dealing with healthcare issues and how you're going to continue to afford to provide healthcare for your citizens, where does the $3 billion a year that Keir Starmer has promised Ukraine for their defense and for their military involvement, where's that money coming from? I don't think there's some sort of a unicorn fairy at Buckingham Palace that's just going to crank out pounds to pay all this stuff. So where's the money going to come from? And I think that Brits are soon going to be in the same position that we are in the U.S., asking, where's the money gone? We know it's been fraud. We know that Ukraine is corrupt. They can't account for hundreds of billions of dollars. And I think that there is a real desire by America to stop the funding when we don't really see a value being brought here. And particularly, again, are you ready to see British boots on the ground, American boots on the ground, and body bags coming back on a war people are not even willing to keep funding, much less keep funding with men and blood?
Donald Trump has made his views on the EU clear again within the last 24 hours or so. He was with the Taoiseach, Micheál Martin. He said the US had been abused by the EU. We've been abused for a long time and we will be abused no longer. I'm not happy with the European Union. We're going to win that financial battle. I am less concerned about the EU and much more concerned about my own country. And I wonder whether you think that the United Kingdom might somehow get through this in some way, because we're told Britain is in this race to secure an economic deal with President Trump, perhaps even as soon as the end of this month. I just wonder what sort of priority you think will be put on the UK in regard to this in this deal. Obviously, he met Starmer a couple of weeks ago.
I think the UK is in a much better position to kind of skate through with a new deal. First of all, most of our trade imbalance with the UK is in services. We sell less services to you than you guys provide to us. That's a big part of the trade deficit, not as much the manufacturing side, which is what Trump is concerned with, of how do you bring jobs, how do you bring manufacturing back to the U.S. That's a big part of the fight with Canada when you have dairy products affecting our farmers and others at 200% and 300% tariffs in Canada. And then when Trump says, well, we're just going to make everything equal, they scream and squeal. So you don't have, I think, the manufacturing battle with the UK that you do with, say, Canada or with the EU. Again, it was interesting when you were talking about some of the tariffs that may be put on European alcohol products.
Yes.
And you were quick to point out, that includes whiskey and rum and everything else. That's what alcohol is.
Well, indeed,
but they've already been imposing very high tariffs on Jack Daniel's whiskey. So you can't have it both ways. You can't punish our products and then get a pass for yours.
Thanks, Steve. That is Steve Gill. He's a former advisor to the Clinton and Bush administrations. We're going to get your calls and thoughts on this as well very, very soon. We're also going to talk to Norman Warner. He was a Labour Health Minister, about whether he thinks the abolition of NHS England is a good idea. What do you think? Let us know during the break.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Good evening, it's just gone 5 o'clock. I'm Peter Cardwell. This is Talk Drive. Thank you very much indeed for your company, whether you're listening at home, whether you're one of the Cardwellers driving home, or however you're listening or watching our programmes. We want to hear from you today because there's a lot to comment on, including the NHS scrapping NHS England. Will it make a difference? 0344 499 1000 is the number to call. Quite a few people getting in touch saying that it's a good thing we're discussing Syria. That's coming up soon. We will discuss the story that so much of the media is actually ignoring what is happening there. The British taxpayer has given Syria about £50 million in foreign aid to the new regime that's running it, HTS. Should we have done that? What are they doing? Well, they're murdering a lot of their political opponents. We'll get into that with Andrew Fox very, very soon. And what does it mean in terms of the jihadi threat to here in the United Kingdom? We're asking the question as well, what is terrorism? We talked about that in the last hour as well. And we've got the sport this hour. We'll take your thoughts as well. As I said, the main number 0344 499 1000. You can text me 87222 with the word talk in your text. You can tweet me at talkTV, follow me at Peter Cardwell. You can send me a voice note on the main number. You can send me a text message, WhatsApp text message on the main number, and you can give me a ring on the main number, which is 0344 499 1000. Stay with me until 7 o'clock here on Talk. Farm subsidies is another thing we're talking about in the programme. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on. And the Daniel Zeichner, who is the farming minister, says that he thinks that farming subsidies should end completely. Well, 2027 is when the EU farm subsidies, which have been matched by the UK government, are going to end. If you're a farmer, we'd love to hear from you. If you're someone who thinks this is an important issue, Lenny in Ashford certainly does. He has tweeted me to say, I believe farm subsidies benefit 100% of the population. So Starmer's actions again punish the poor and the needy. His channel vision is, I think he means perhaps tunnel vision, is a disaster for our country. Melindy, talking about the NHS, says, already fascinated listening about why the Tories couldn't or wouldn't do this with NHS England. I wonder if this will inspire them to grow a pair. I suspect the answer will be no. Another person says, personally, I want as many people as possible to lose their jobs in the NHS. Well, I don't, I must say. I don't want anybody to be unemployed. As I said earlier in the programme, I lost my job 3 times before I was 30. It's not a pleasant experience, let me tell you. This person says, James says, unfortunately there will be no growth. All the mundane, well-paid manufacturing jobs that provided a decent standard of living went to the Far East or to Eastern Europe 20 or 30 years ago, and they aren't coming back. We can't all work in McDonald's. And a final one from Angie Hodson, who says, what happens when the farmers are prevented from simply doing their job, i.e. feeding the nation? No food means starvation for the people of the United Kingdom. Well, we're going to talk about that. You can talk about it too. Give me a ring, send me a voice note, 0344 499 1000. Steve has sent me one on the topic we're going to talk to Lord Warner about in just a second. Let's hear first what Steve has said on the NHS and the big reorganisation that is happening, the abolition of NHS England. It's gone from Quango to Quangon. This is what Steve says.
Peter, Steve from Manchester, great show. In regards to the NHS, my father used to tell me many years ago, if you work for a company and the company starts to get more office workers than it does men on the shop floor, it's time to leave because that company's going under. And I think this is the same as the NHS. There's just way too many people sat in the office doing bugger all when they should be employing more nurses and more doctors and more staff that take care of patients. Keep up the good work, mate. See you later.
Thank you, Steve. Let's speak to Lord Warner now. He is, Norman Warner is a former Labour Health Minister. Norman, thank you for joining me today. What do you think about the abolition of NHS England? I presume, although I don't want to put words in your mouth, that when it was set up under Andrew Lansley, the Health Secretary previously, that you didn't support it then.
That's absolutely correct. Lansley and Cameron got themselves into a terrible tangle back in 2013, not only with the establishment of NHS England, but with some of the other changes that they introduced alongside it. I've been against doing this because we managed to, since about the 1980s, we've managed to deal with running the NHS with a chief executive who was in the Department of Health, working with ministers. And what's happened with NHS England is totally ballooned out of control. I mean, there's 15,500 people working in it. This is a kind of crazy number when we are really struggling to find extra money for the NHS and indeed for social care. And I think it's taken a long time to get to this point, but this is absolutely the right decision given the financial state we are actually in.
Will it make a difference? Because we'll get rid of some civil servants. Certainly we're hearing that 9,500 people are going to lose their jobs, although I imagine there'll be a big battle with the unions on that. But Norman, will this really change things? Do you think that perhaps there'll be more money or there'll be a better service for people who are going into A&E or trying to get a GP's appointment, or however most people actually access the NHS?
Well, I think what's happened is that these empires, individual empires, have been built within NHS England, controlling what's going on at the local level. Well, at the end of the day, I think if we cut this body down to size and bring it back into the Department of Health, we will see that the government will be forced to devolve more decision making locally. And I'm a great fan of more decision making locally, because I think at the end of the day, different parts of the country are in different situations, and trying to pull all the decisions up to the centre simply hasn't worked. The evidence is not in favour of more centralisation. The evidence is in more devolution, and getting rid of NHS England will, I think, help that process.
But many people say even within that devolution or within the local trusts and so on, there's too much bureaucracy there as well, and centralising things like, for example, procurement would make sense because you have different trusts spending vastly different and duplicating a lot of different work.
Well, I think the age-old story about too many managers in the NHS has been going on since 1948. And we do need some decent managers. We do need managers to manage the NHS, both at the local, regional and national level. What I've seen going on with NHS England is it aggregating more power into the centre, slowing down, and all that does is slow down the decision-making process. People get unconfident about taking decisions at the local level because they're expected to keep clearing everything at the national level. And I think we will see a change of attitude to with more decision taking place locally. And that's going to be good news for patients, because I think they will get services quicker under a more devolved system.
It's a very interesting point, actually, and I just wonder more generally. I mean, Starmer says, I will tackle our flabby state, and what I worked, as you may know, as a special advisor in government for 3.5 years, and anytime anybody tried to take on the civil service, I always cautioned and said, what you need to realise, as a political appointee as I then was, there are more of them than there are of us. And when you look into the unions and so on as well, resisting a lot of this change, I wonder, first of all, if you agree that it is a flabby state, and secondly, more generally, whether you think that Keir Starmer can actually change that dramatically.
Well, I was a senior civil servant as well as a special advisor and a minister. And the civil service is nervous. It's a risk-averse system. And you can't run modern services, public services, without taking some risk and taking some chances. And I think what we're going to see is a much more brisker civil service, having to take decisions much more rapidly and trying to get much more movement in terms of delivery of services at the local level.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. I wonder just more generally, there's another slight, mini issue, certainly it's been rumbling on for a few days now about the Labour Party, and Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary. Let's just take a look at him correcting the record in Parliament in regard to his previous employment. He said he was a solicitor, but actually he was not.
It has come to my attention that in a speech I gave on the 28th of April 2014, recorded in column 614 of Hansard on the subject of high-speed rail, I made a reference to my experience of using our local transport system in Greater Manchester when I worked as a solicitor in Manchester city centre. I should have made clear that specifically, Madam Deputy Speaker, that was a reference at the time to being a trainee solicitor. This was an inadvertent error, and although this speech was over a decade ago, as it has been brought to my attention, I would like to formally correct the record, and I seek your advice on doing so.
That's Jonathan Reynolds there, the business secretary. We've had as well, Norman, we've had all sorts of issues in regard to Rachel Reeves and her CV. Does this matter much, do you think? I mean, we want politicians to tell the truth, of course, particularly when it comes to their CVs.
Well, I think there are a lot of people in society who burnish their CVs to the best effect to attract an employer. But I think these slips by Rachel Reeves and Jonathan Reynolds are pretty modest stuff in terms of the corruption stakes. And I mean, they're silly slips. They shouldn't have happened, but they have happened. People have apologised, and they just have to be a bit more careful in future. I'm much more worried about people who don't perform than I am about people who burnish their CVs a little bit.
Norman, thank you very much for your thoughts today. That's Norman Warner, Lord Warner, who's a former Labour Health Minister. Lots to discuss there. What do you think about it? Jonathan Reynolds finally correcting the record there in Parliament. Thank you to Lewis, who says terrorism is explained in the English dictionary. We have far too many crazy people in this country nowadays, says Lewis. And certainly we heard from Ian Aitchison there a little bit earlier on, talking about the different aspects of terrorism and how it means certain things in regard to political, religious or ideological terror. Mike says, oh, come off it, Peter. It says, oh, do come off it, Peter. I believe Trump isn't just making noises threatening Russia when he actually does something to, let me start again. Why don't I start again? Mike in Lincoln says, oh, do come off it, Peter. I'll believe Trump isn't just making noises threatening Russia when he actually does something to punish them when they inevitably break a ceasefire or indeed make unreasonable demands. He'll just tell Ukraine to give more and more, says Mike in Lincoln. Thank you for that. On farmers, Jay in Essex has been in touch. He's given me a ring, 0344 499 1000. Jay, what do you think of this idea from the Labour government that subsidies for farmers, often representing about 40% of their income, could actually disappear?
Hi, Peter.
Hi, Jay.
I think the way this government is treating our farmers is absolutely disgusting. Most of the civil servants and the government are absolutely useless. They can't see past the end of their nose. With all the different wars going on in this world, it's never going to change. With all the asylum seekers moving all around the world, the sheer number of people that need to be fed. I mean, you look in the supermarkets, you get runner beans from Uganda and places like that. At some point, if there is another war, which there probably will be in our lifetime, that will stop. Remember how it was with COVID, with like the shortage, and when Russia invaded Ukraine and there was no grain coming out because they'd blocked the ports.
Yes. It's this whole idea of food security, isn't it? Being able to feed yourself. But there seems to be a lot of movement, certainly, to say scrap the subsidies and then get, use a lot of that farmland, for example, for green energy. And that's something you clearly disagree with, Jay.
It's fairness as well, isn't it? They work their socks off 7 days a week. I'm not a farmer, I don't know any, so I've got no skin in the game.
Although on the fairness issue, sorry to interrupt you, Jay, but on the fairness issue, some people might say, well, hold on a second, it's not fair to get 40% of your income as basically a handout.
Yeah, but they're not getting it, are they? They're caretakers of the land. They pass
Well, they get the money, they get the subsidy, and that helps run the farm.
Yeah, but we need them. It's as simple as that. When you think what they're paying the train drivers, £80,000 a year for 4 days.
Do we need them as well?
Well, you need them, but you don't need to pay them £80,000 a year. Absolutely, you're happy to do that. And then hammer the farmers. The government are absolutely useless. They're not looking past the end of their nose. At the end of the day, all these foreign countries, if you look all the ones where all the wars are, they've got too many people and too little food. And that's why there's so much trouble in those countries. We're going to end up the same.
Yeah. Okay, Jay, thanks for your thoughts this tea time. Really appreciate that. That's Jay from Essex there. We're going to talk in just a second to Andrew Fox. As promised, we will talk properly about Syria in a way that so much of the media haven't. It could have big, big implications here at home as well. First of all, did you know, maybe you didn't, that 50 million quid of your money has gone to the regime in Syria, to HTS, this outfit that is running Syria now, and they are killing their opponents. There's about 1,000 people more, actually, who have been murdered by that regime. What's going on there? How stable is it? And could some of those jihadis actually be coming to Britain? Because that's a major, major problem. Bashar al-Assad, bad guy, horrible person, glad he's gone. But simply by saying what comes in to replace Bashar al-Assad is, you know, a wonderful thing and we should all be grateful. Well, actually, that's a very, very risky thing. And I think we need a little bit of critical thinking about this. So let's educate ourselves. I have a lot to learn as well. And we're going to learn it from Andrew Fox. He's a defence expert, former paratrooper and research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. You're going to want to hear this because I tell you something, a lot of the media is completely ignoring this story. We are not going to. This is one of the main programmes on Talk. It is drive time. We're going to talk about it at a prominent slot at 5:20, and we're going to make sure that it's talked about properly in just a minute here on Talk.
A lot of people are suckered in by the label on the tin that might say hate. Oh, we're cracking down on hate or racism or sexism, and they don't actually open up that tin to see what that label actually is covering. So, for example, is mispronouncing somebody's name hate and racism, or is it just an innocent mistake? Well, again, these are the kinds of subtleties that those police officers will miss because they just buy whatever it is that is in the name of that label.
Yeah.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well, there's been an awful lot that has happened, especially in the last week or so in Syria, and we know that I just feel an awful lot of the media is just ignoring this story, and I wonder, and maybe I'm wrong, we're going to talk to Andrew Fox, who's an expert, in just a second, but I do wonder whether it's because the narrative was Bashar al-Assad, the previous dictator, murderous, horrendous man, barrel-bombed his own people with those, I mean, absolutely horrendous actions against them, killing many, many innocent people. He gets deposed. Great, fine, he's gone, good. no tears shed over that one. But who is he replaced by? And are we too quick to actually say, well, any replacement is better than Bashar al-Assad? The new president is called Ahmed al-Sharaa, and we know within the last week that many Alawites, Christians, Druze people have been targeted by various rebels, various groupings. Could they be linked? Some say they are, to the new government of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is known as HTS. Let's talk to an expert, Andrew Fox. He is a former paratrooper, a defence expert and a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. Andrew, first of all, what is your assessment of the job that has been done by the new president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, a strong man himself? Have they just replaced one Islamist strongman with another?
Well, we have to remember that HTS essentially started life as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And al-Sharaa was known as al-Jalani for a long time, and that was his nom de guerre as a senior ISIS commander in Syria. So this is a guy with a very patchy history, shall we say. However, before they took over from al-Assad, they controlled areas of the north of Syria. Obviously, the Assad regime didn't have full control over the whole of Syria for a very long time. And actually, they weren't too bad comparatively when they had control of northern Syria. There were some human rights violations, but actually, in terms of the scale of things, it was reasonably moderate. And certainly that's the face that al-Sharaa has presented to the West. He's done his tours of the United Nations, of the International Criminal Court, of Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell's podcast.
Yes, he's been feted by them. Perhaps that wasn't the best idea for Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell.
Yeah, well, the issue I think in Syria at the moment is that al-Sharaa doesn't have full control over everyone in HTS, and there's another sort of group called SNA, the Syrian National Army, who are backed by Turkey, and it certainly appears like they're the group that's committing a large number of the atrocities that are happening, as well as some of HTS's foot soldiers. So we're in acronym soup. It's deeply complex. Al-Jalani, I think, has the right intention, but whether the ISIS, Al-Qaeda foot soldiers that make up part of his grouping are fully under his control, I think, is the question. And I'd suggest at this moment they're probably not.
Give us a sense of what has happened, especially over the past week or 10 days or so. There have been over 1,000 people who have been murdered in these clashes.
So it started off on the west coast, on the Mediterranean, where pro-Assad forces tried to seize control of two of the main ports that reach the Mediterranean. Off the back of that, there were a number of reprisals against the Alawite community. Now, that's the sect that Bashar al-Assad was a member of, and swept up in that, of course, is the Christian community and then other dissenters as well. So it sort of had a spiral of violence based around this Assadist uprising that happened about a week ago. The videos coming out of Syria are truly appalling. They're right up there with 7th of October in terms of some of the horrors of whole families being executed, people just being lined up and shot dead in their homes. And a variety of other atrocities have been doing the rounds as well. Always remembering, of course, that there's a lot of misinformation out there because there's a lot of people with fingers in the Syrian pie. Iran are involved. They're trying to reclaim their influence so they can get their pipeline back to Lebanon going again. Russia are involved because they were really keen on retaining the port areas that the Alawites tried to seize. And of course, Israel are a player as well, and the United States. So there's a lot of outside factors coming in here as well, a lot of disinformation, a lot of videos from earlier in the Syria war as far back as 2012 are doing the rounds. So we have to be very careful of the footage we're seeing. But certainly there's beyond no doubt that a number of innocent people have been killed in the most extreme circumstances.
What has been the reasoning and the process and the thoughts behind Israeli airstrikes that have happened in the last 24 hours, Andrew?
So Israel clearly has the memory of 7th of October sort of uppermost in its mind, and quite understandably so. And they're very keen that none of the extremist elements in Syria get their hands on Assad regime weaponry that might be used to escalate violence both within Syria and against Israel itself.
Am I right in saying, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but am I right in remembering that very shortly after Assad fell, that there were bombings by Israel to try to get rid of some of those weapons?
There were. So Israel struck a bunch of former Assad regime sites and made sure that some of the really big weaponry was taken out of the game. At the same time, the United States actually deployed B-52s from Qatar, the big heavy bombers, to attack ISIS positions in Syria, because they're still a force that has influence there. And the last thing that we wanted, I think, anyone in the West, is those people to get their hands on the chemical weapons that we know Assad has, not to mention the heavy artillery and all the other kind of conventional military equipment that would have been loitering around. And so I'd imagine, obviously I've not seen the Israeli plans, but my best guess is that that's what they've been striking.
Yeah. We've given, here in the UK, we've given something like £50 million of aid to the new regime. And it's interesting as well that I don't know if you agree with this, but my sense, and you're the expert, is that a lot of the media in the UK are basically ignoring what's going on in Syria and really not talking about it. I wonder whether that is because, well, I wonder why it is, in your view. A cynic would say that essentially it doesn't fit the narrative, that actually everything's perfect there now and we should all just move on, nothing to see here.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one, isn't it? And when we talk about the 50 million that the UK gave, I think it's probably important to note that that went through proper UN agencies and various other sort of very legitimate channels, rather than just giving 50 million to Al-Sharaa or Al-Jalani or HTS.
And we should just again, apologies to interrupt you, I promise I'll come back to you in a second, Andrew. Let's just actually play a little clip now from David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, when he was talking about this aid. This was a little while ago.
Well, today I'm announcing a £50 million package of support and aid to Syria, and I support the ACBA principles that were agreed yesterday. We want to see a Syrian-led and a Syrian-owned future. HDS remains a prescribed organisation, but we can have diplomatic contact, and so we do have diplomatic contact, as you would expect.
Well, it's David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, speaking on the 15th of December. Andrew, I rudely interrupted you. Continue your thoughts, please.
Yeah, of course. I think it's worth noting that when we talk about, who's going to be talking to the UK, based on what Mr. Lammy said back in December, we kind of have to pick who we're going to talk to here. We can't not talk to anyone in Syria. I mean, we could, but we wouldn't have a dog in the fight if we did that. So we have to kind of pick where we're going. And the one positive I can see from HTS, and of course we all wanted a bright future for Syria, we all wanted the end of Assad to mean a brand new start for a very troubled country. But the one bright spot here is that the Kurds just this week have signed a deal with the HTS government to retain their areas as part of Syria going forward. Now, that's really important because the other factor here is Turkey. The SNA I mentioned, the Syrian National Army, who've been carrying out so many of these atrocities, are heavily Turkish-backed. The Turkish have been directly attacking the Kurdish areas in Syria. Huge numbers of casualties up in the north and east of Syria from Turkish airstrikes. And the fact that the Kurds are willing to do a deal with Al-Sharaa and HTS suggests to me that perhaps they still are, at this point, the best horse to back in this race, bearing in mind that none of them are people we would ideally want to invite round for dinner. I think that's probably the easiest way to put it. And
the media aspect of this, Andrew?
Yeah, and I think, as you say, there's a sort of cognitive dissonance here, isn't there? We were really hoping that HTS was a step forward. Clearly, Assad was a disaster and an absolute monster. Now sitting happily in Moscow, cozying up to Putin. And I think the media have taken their eye off the ball here, quite frankly. It's the only thing I can explain the complete absence of media coverage that's coming out of this, because when we talk about atrocities around the world, there's a number that have been ignored in recent months. So, Congo has barely had a mention.
What was it, 70 Christians were beheaded in Congo recently as well, to say nothing of everything else that's happening there?
Yeah, exactly. And so the world's media tends to get very excited about their hotspot of the day, to the total exclusion of anything else. And unfortunately, Mr. Trump is dominating the headlines with Ukraine at the moment. That's the story, which means that the atrocities in Syria slip by the wayside.
Andrew, I want to ask you a favour. If there's a hotspot that you think we're ignoring, if you think there's a story like Syria that other people are ignoring and we should be doing something on it, can you drop me or my producers a message and say, actually, this is something we should be talking about, this is something your viewers and listeners need to know about, and a lot of the other media are ignoring it? Because I just don't want this to happen again. I want people to know the full facts of what are happening and the implications here in the UK.
Well, it's absolutely commendable, and I wish that the rest of the media took that approach as well. And of course, it would be my absolute pleasure to flag anything up to you that I think is worthy of discussion.
Thank you, Andrew. Much appreciated. That's Andrew Fox there, who's a defence expert, former paratrooper, and a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. So that is talking about Syria, which so much of the media isn't. Malcolm says, Syria, thank you for covering this. Very few are talking about the executions being carried out on the streets by this brutal regime. Christians are also in extreme danger. Well, thank you for that. On the NHS, Joanna in Salisbury says, have they actually said how much it will cost to get rid of these people? Redundancy payments, etc. The unions aren't going to lie down and take it. The cost of strikes and the patient queues growing again. Stuart says, if farmers lose their subsidies, they will be undercut by EU farmers who still get subsidies, says Stuart. And Mandy says, I think Starmer needs to clean out the House of Lords, stop bill payments for MP second homes, and restrict the Speaker's exorbitant spending on flights, and then get rid of the 26 Quangos. I'm not sure where the 26 comes from, but certainly there are many more than that. Foreign aid should be qualified and accounted for, and all councils should be audited on their spending, says Mandy. Well, thank you for those thoughts. We're going to take more of your thoughts after the break. Keep your messages and your calls coming in. 0344 499 1000.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well, thank you to everybody who's been in touch. Just been having a look at my tweets there. Quite a few messages coming through. Grant says, Syria in the media is definitely neglected a fair bit. So many more crazy things happening around the world that we don't delight on. And Grant, as I said, you know, Andrew Fox is one of the experts. I want him to flag up to me, are we missing things? Are there things the media aren't telling you? And you can rely on Talk to tell you the truth about what is happening, whether it's here in the UK or elsewhere. Let's speak now to some of our callers. Luke is in Brighton and wants to talk about welfare reform. Luke, you're very welcome to the programme. What would you like to say?
Peter, how you doing?
Hiya.
Peter, let me first say at the outset that I would recommend to all viewers your book, The Bad Diaries.
Thank you. You're very kind. Thank you.
It was a very informative read for anyone interested in Westminster politics. So,
very kind.
No,
very
kind. Recommend it. I was keen to come on, and obviously I know there's been a lot of discussion. There's been talk about a kind of internal revolt brewing inside the parliamentary Labour Party and the Labour Party more broadly in regards to some of the speculated welfare changes. I mean, I think this is a very multifaceted, nuanced issue. Mm-hmm. I've come at it from the perspective of someone that was a NEET.
Okay.
In terms of being out of
so that's a young person that's not in education, employment or training. So how long were you in that? How long did you have that status for, and how did you move on from that, Luke?
September 2020, and I was out of work for the best part of nearly 2 years. Now, it's true that I had some significant mental health problems that led me to be out of work for a fortunate time, but I think it's also true to say that the period of time I spent out of work was perhaps greater than it could have been. So, and I saw how aimless and how purposeless and somewhat mindless sort of life was. So
that couldn't have been good for your mental health, Luke, to be out of work. No.
As I say, I think it left me feeling sort of relatively directionless. It left me feeling like there was a kind of a big void of kind of the heart of my life. But I also think that speaking from a personal perspective, one of the things that contributed to my politicisation in the kind of the last decade was a lot of the welfare reforms the Tories undertook. I think there were some that were pernicious, particularly in terms of the two-child benefit cap or the removal of the £20 uplift payment as you came out of COVID as part of universal credit. So I also think it's important that these matters are always undertaken from a place of compassion.
How can you, as someone who's been through the welfare system yourself, Luke, as you correctly say, I mean, how do we reform it? How do we make it fair, do you think? What should happen, or should anything happen?
I think it was Matthew Holbert, our mutual friend before Christmas, also on your programme, talked about the importance of a combination of a carrot and stick approach, and I'd be very much agree with that.
Oh, we're just losing you, Luke. Come back to the microphone.
Sorry,
There we go. Much better. Go ahead.
As I say, I think our mutual friend Matthew Holbert, he spoke before Christmas about the importance of a combination of a carrot and stick approach. Also on your programme, and I would very much agree with him in that regard. I mean, I think it's important to note that between 2010 and 2014, we saw adult education services cut in half by the Tories. We saw staff in further education have their wages drop by nearly 40% in real terms.
Well, how do you feel now Labour is looking to make some of those similar cuts and to make very, very significant cuts to welfare? I mean, how does that make you feel as someone who is anti-Tory?
Well, as I say, I think, if we do see a reinstatement of the carrot and stick approach, because I think under the Tories we saw too much emphasis on the stick as opposed to the carrot. If we see, the returning of funding to some of those adult education services, recognising our economy is consistently evolving, and we do need to reskill, older workforces for the kind of newer jobs coming onto the scene. And I've got no problem with measures such as, the removal of driving licences or, punishments being issued to those that are being very much, aided and abetted by the state returning to work and are simply refusing to when they are capable of doing so. So I have no problem with a combination of a carrot and stick approach. I just think under the last government, the emphasis was far too much on the stick as opposed to the carrot.
Just before you go, Luke, can I just ask you, do you have a job now? Are you happy in that job? And how's your mental health?
Yes, my mental health is much improved, thank you. Still a work in progress, but things have picked up. I've been in the security industry for the last couple of years, so I've mainly worked in NHS security, which has been very rewarding, primarily supporting assisting mental health patients, working in psychiatric units and in A&E units across Sussex. But I'm very keen. I used to work for the Labour Party, and I'm very keen to work in politics or journalism once again, so I'm hoping to try and pursue
Great stuff. Well, Luke, thanks for the call. Great call. Do give us another ring on another occasion, Luke, in Brighton there. Lots to chew over there, and thank you for that. On Jonathan Reynolds, Lorraine has been in touch and says it's such a disappointment but no surprise that Lord Warner seeks to minimise Reynolds lying about his qualifications and career. Reynolds knew he didn't qualify but chose to deceive and manipulate the public and Parliament on numerous occasions. He has committed an offence, and to say it's not a huge deal highlights disdain for the electorate. Starmer, the once Director of Public Prosecutions, and accepting his apology just shows himself as a hypocrite. This government has built its foundations on a web of lies and deceit. Both Starmer and Reynolds have a total lack of moral compass and integrity. Reynolds disgracefully blamed an aide for his mistake, says Lorraine. Imagine if this was Farage, Labour and Starmer would be screaming, resign. The man is a barefaced liar and he must go. Tony says, my wife has worked in admin for the NHS for years in many roles. She tells me that the cutbacks over the past 10 years have left things in a dangerous state. Farmers is another aspect, and farm subsidies, really big thing that people want to talk about today. Let's speak to Claude in Surrey, who's given me a ring on 0344 499 1000. Claude, you're very welcome to the programme. What would you like to say?
Hi, Peter. So
Hi there.
I wanted to share about the importance of farmers and supporting our farmers, because they are the backbone of Britain, and especially when we talk about our food and horticulture and what we're able to, have our fresh produce. I'm very concerned because I found that 91% of farmers are struggling with their mental health.
How do you know that? Where have you read that?
It's by a recent article that showed that there is a big concern. It's done by Farming Life.
Okay,
and
sure.
What I found is that the more we kind of not support our farmers and the more we do not invest into our own home affairs, the more the crises we face. And what I think is really interesting is we do have this kind of increase of AI, and I do wonder if there's a bit of an element of concern when it comes to farmers and also AI and also the land element and that element of building more
and that's a big part of it. But what would you say, Claude, to people who say, hold on a second, 40% of farmers' income is money we just give them, when actually, if we didn't do that, perhaps we could spend some of that money, or the money could go to somewhere else in the taxation system, the NHS or whatever, and actually we could get cheaper food from elsewhere?
I think it comes down to the importance of quality food and not really sacrificing what is really important to the fabric of Britain, and also looking at the importance of when we talk about balancing the books, we need to balance the books much more better. I think the government has been for time, unfortunately, balancing the books in the wrong way, which some people would agree with me in the fact of, war and not home affairs. And I think this is why we find that it's almost like we're having to sacrifice our own home affairs with like farmers, and why should we have to face those challenges, really?
Okay. Claude, thanks very much for your thoughts. That was Claude in Surrey there. Let me read out a couple of messages, including from Kenny in Edinburgh, who says, if Donald Trump wants to punish Russia financially, he should try to get Rachel Reeves to become the Russian Chancellor. That would really make the Russians suffer. On David Lammy, another member of the Cabinet, someone else has been in touch and says, we must never forget that David Lammy immediately refunded UNRWA. That was, of course, the refugee agency that the United Nations has in Gaza. UNRWA is known to have Hamas terrorists among them. That's absolutely true. David Lammy had the temerity to remove a yellow pin badge expressing solidarity with the Israeli hostages when meeting Palestinians, and now he supports Syrian terrorism with millions of taxpayers' money. I really do think it is time for the man to be thoroughly investigated for his motives. Well, that is a very strong opinion from Lorraine. I'm sure David Lammy would absolutely balk at the suggestion and deny that he supports terrorism in any way. But there is a big question, I think, that has to be asked about the £50 million of taxpayers' money that was given to HTS in Syria, and also the point that is made by Lorraine there in regard to UNRWA. And actually, there was a day not that long ago, a few weeks ago, that on the same day, Labour government announced that £17 million was being taken away from maths schemes within our schools in England, and on the same day that £17 million was going to be given to UNRWA, which is riddled with Hamas terrorists. It indoctrinates children in Gaza to hate Israelis and hate Jews as well, and is an organisation that I don't think should have a penny of our money. Stuart has been in touch and says, Peter, regarding Syria, the media is ignoring it because they can't blame the Israelis, says Stuart. Don't worry, Stuart, they'll find a way to do that, I'm sure, at the BBC. Kevin is in North Yorkshire. Kevin, I think it's maybe terrorism that you have perhaps given me a ring about. You're very welcome to the programme.
Hello, thank you. Yeah, I was just about the Rudolph incident in Southport. I was just saying that the guest that you had on mentioned that they were wanting to maybe hold back information with regards to community cohesion.
Yes.
And I think what we miss here is the point that that very fact is that it's hard to have community cohesion when you've got several communities. And that's part of the problem, is that the integration issue. If we had a community, if there was a community, a true community, then that wouldn't be a source or an issue. But the very fact that you have to apply those reasons to this is an indicator of where we need to rethink the whole thing. You shouldn't have to worry about community cohesion, but we do, because we don't have a true community.
Well,
we have
Kevin,
several communities.
Kevin, I think that you've made a really, really good point there, and I appreciate you making the point. The other aspect of this, I think, is, these were facts. These were things that were truthful. These were things that would have actually helped, perhaps, in Jonathan Hall, the independent reviewer of terrorism's estimation, would have actually reduced the temperature. And I think your point is a very, very strong one. We need to find some sort of link between communities. Multiculturalism, I think, has failed. But at the same time, why weren't we just treated as adults during that time as well and being given the information that would have actually made people say, okay, now we have the full information, nothing is being kept from us. The government and the authorities and the police service are telling us the truth.
Want to treat us as adults because they don't want to admit, like an adult should, that the whole thing has failed. The whole point of not treating you like an adult is to put you to the point where infantilize you to the point where they have to treat you like children because they can't admit that they've made it wrong. They've got the whole issue wrong, and to do that, obviously it's their responsibility. It's our fault. It's not their fault. It's our fault that it's all gone wrong. You know, we are the ones that need protecting from ourselves. It is not that. The fact of the matter is it's failed. It needs addressing. There needs to be integration. Nothing wrong with people coming. Nothing wrong with people coming to our community. They've got things to offer, but they need to adjust to the point of, you know, the fact that they need to integrate.
Yeah.
And we need a true community, not several communities that have competing issues and competing agendas. That's the problem.
Kevin, great call. Thank you for it. Ring me again anytime. That's Kevin, North Yorkshire there. Lots of really, really intelligent thoughts there from Kevin and our other callers there. Thank you for that. We're going to talk about the sport next here on Talk.
A lot of people are suckered in by the label on the tin that might say hate. We're cracking down on hate or racism or sexism, and they don't actually open up that tin to see what that label actually is covering. So, for example, is mispronouncing somebody's name hate and racism, or is it just an innocent mistake? Well, again, these are the kinds of subtleties that those police officers will miss because they just buy whatever it is that is in the name of that label.
Yeah.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well, thank you so much to everybody who's contributed today. We're going to take many more calls between now and 7 o'clock, and you know the number. It is 0344 499 1000. You can give me a ring on that number, or you can send me a WhatsApp text message, or indeed a WhatsApp voice message as well. We take those as well. If you keep them to less than a minute, we'll make sure we play out as many as we can. But now it is time for the
Sport Summary on Talk.
Well, Neil Candola is with us here in the studio. And Neil, thanks for coming in, really appreciate it. The Champions League is the big one that we're going to talk about. Arsenal facing Real Madrid after cruising through on aggregate. Lucky them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, the game in terms of the second leg finished 2-2 against PSV. It was 9-3 on aggregate, so it's safe to say that the job was firmly done in the first leg. Look, they've set themselves up with arguably the greatest time, maybe not just in football but in sport alone. To be able to play Real Madrid over 2 legs, home and away, I think is a phenomenal achievement from Arsenal. I think it shows how far they've come over the last few years under Mikel Arteta. I am a little bit sceptical of their opportunity and their chances to progress, because Real Madrid, they are just the kings of the Champions League, kings of Europe, and probably kings of football as well. So that will be an absolutely fascinating tie. I think, of course, the way that Real Madrid beat their city rivals Atletico yesterday was...
huge controversy there.
Absolutely, yeah. So, of course, went to penalties. Atletico levelled the score on aggregate to 1-1 within the first minute. Englishman Conor Gallagher was the one who scored the goal. It went all the way through the 90 minutes, all the way through extra time, went to penalties, and just when Atletico thought, I think they made it 2-2 on penalties, the VAR realised that there was a double touch. So Julian Alvarez, who was of course a former Manchester City player, took his penalty and he slightly slipped, and VAR showed that the ball actually came off both feet, which can't happen. So instead of any retakes, which a lot of people, especially on TalkSport, have been potentially calling out for, the penalty was disallowed as a goal and was given as a miss.
What do you think? Should there have been a retake?
Well, look, the rules, I can understand if you have a problem with the rules, that's one conversation, but the referees enforcing the laws within the game surely cannot be a problem. So I think it is very harsh.
I think it is a problem. I think it can be a problem from
exactly.
time to time.
So
certainly.
A little bit harsh, but look, I think the rules are the rules, as I say. So they are fortunate to go through Real Madrid, but they are very used to the big spotlight on them in this competition.
Tell us about the Europa League. What's on the menu tonight?
Yeah, a very, very busy, and not just a busy, but a very important day for Manchester United and Tottenham, respectively. Both of them in Europa League action. Tottenham go into the second leg 1-0 down against AZ Alkmaar. Of course, if they fail to win or go through, then Tottenham will be out of all of the competitions. And I think the big problem with this is, look, you can go seasons without any trophies. You don't have to ask Tottenham fans too much about that. But look, the fact that...
Throwing a bit of shade there, Neil.
Professional shade. But jokes aside, I think Ange Postecoglou coming out a few months ago and saying, I always win something in my second season. Wherever I've been, no matter what club it is, the second season is always the season I deliver a trophy. If he loses or even draws this evening, he's out, which I don't think will be just the trophies that have gone down the drain. I also think potentially his time at Tottenham will also as well go.
Okay, so it's make or break for him.
So it's make or break, and sticking very closely to the make or break, Manchester United in action as well, of course, on TalkSport. Coverage starts at 7 with kick-off at 8 p.m. They're 1-1 with Real Sociedad, but their home form has been absolutely terrible since Ruben Amorim has come in. They haven't been able to find any real decent set of results, fixtures, or even form for that matter. So again, very similar to Tottenham, if they crash out of the Europa League this evening, their season is done as well. They won't be able to get Champions League qualification domestically, and they're out of all of the cups as well. So another massive night, not just for Tottenham, not just for Manchester United, but I think for all of the English clubs.
Tell us about the Scottish club Rangers as well.
Yeah, massive night this evening. They are 3-1 up against certain Jose Mourinho's Fenerbahce side. So, of course, look, Jose Mourinho is an absolute legend of the game, and the fact that they're going into this game in the second leg 3-1 up, there is still a job to do. I think there is this notion that if you lead a game by 2 goals, it's always a dangerous scoreline because a bit of complacency can set in. One goal can change the whole outlook of the game, of the tie. So I think Rangers will be very desperate to at least get the first goal and really put their nerves at ease. But what an amazing evening it could be to knock out Jose Mourinho's side in Europe. That is an incredible feat for Rangers. So hopefully anyway, from a British perspective, that Man United, Tottenham and Rangers all respectively can get through to the next round.
Obviously we should talk about Cheltenham, but the main one, of course, the big story was today that a horse in the 2 o'clock was called Coldwell Potter, and my surname is Cardwell, which sounds a bit like Coldwell, and a number of people actually bet on it because it sounded a bit like my name. name. They've messaged me on Twitter, and I came in first. So there we are. I wasn't aware that it existed. But day 3 of Cheltenham today, coming to an end tomorrow with the Gold Cup, of course. I've witnessed it myself. Who are the favourites in the Gold Cup?
Yeah, so the favourites. This is the thing, though, with Cheltenham this year. You know, we were only just talking about it in the TalkSport office a matter of minutes ago of how much money has been lost, not just in this office but around the country, because a lot of the favourites haven't actually shown up this Cheltenham Festival. So, of course, if you've backed the lesser favourite, shall we say, it's of course better odds, and you'll be in there for a good bit of money. But in terms of the Gold Cup, Willie Mullins, obviously on Galloping to Champs, he is the big favourite. He's already had the most winners this week, so of course he's going to go into that with a lot of people hoping he's going to win. Of course, if they put a bit of money on him, but of course, if he does do that, he'll equal the record of 3 Gold Cups in a row, which would be an absolutely amazing achievement, and of course, put him in the limelight for, you know, sports personality or achievement of the year and all of that kind of stuff. So a very exciting week. I think a week full of shocks, and I don't think it's going to ease up any time tomorrow with the Gold Cup. And I had a little look at the odds. We've got a horse here called Gentleman's Game at 66 to 1.
Wow.
So if this week
Worth a quid on that one.
if there's anything to go by this week, exactly that. A little pound won't hurt anyone, will it?
Excellent stuff. And Neil, thank you very much indeed. That's Neil Candola, who is a TalkSport presenter, bring us all the sporting action. I know that a number of our colleagues are at Cheltenham, including Mr. Jeremy Kyle, and indeed the big boss, the Ayatollah of audio himself, Denny Morris, is at Cheltenham as well. Kenny in Edinburgh says, hi Cardi P, so the government think the way to improve the NHS in England is to bring it under the control of the government, i.e. the Labour government. The NHS in England can now kiss its backside goodbye, says Kenny. Linda has given me a ring from London about benefit reform. Linda, what do you think about these proposed changes that the Labour government want to do?
I think that they're a false economy, if I'm honest.
Why is that?
Well, because I'm not obviously against more people being supported back into work. Absolutely makes sense. But don't touch PIP. The other out-of-work benefits for disability, maybe. But I think also a lot of people don't understand PIP has absolutely nothing to do with your ability to work. It's the government's own recognition that for many people with a long-term health condition or disability, your cost of living is higher.
And we know that there are, the cost of living is higher for lots of different reasons. For example, if you're disabled, your hot water bill is going to be higher because it takes you longer to shower, for example, or you might need to take a bath for that reason. Linda, do you receive it yourself?
My husband does.
And do you mind in as much as you want to tell us why he gets that?
Absolutely. So he's quite happy for me as well. He's nodding at me in the corner. My husband has a condition called ankylosing spondylitis. It's a degenerative condition. He's 54. It normally manifests itself in your early teen years. He's been disabled his entire life. His spine basically is fused. It doesn't matter how much intervention he gets. We can only keep the mobility he has. He's not going to get any better. So he does have a 10-year PIP award, which are quite rare, but it was the recognition a few years ago that it was pointless every 2 years assessing some people with degenerative conditions.
Do you know what, Linda? Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt you. This is a great call, and I want to continue it. If we give you a ring back at 6:15, could we continue the discussion? Would that be all right?
Absolutely fine.
Brilliant.
I've got time to make a cuppa then.
Sounds good. We'll talk to Linda then. It's just we're going to go into the news and we have another guest waiting as well. But Linda has a really good and interesting story to tell, especially around personal independence payments. And I want to make sure that we talk to her properly and give her the time to make her points. So we'll do that. You can make your points as well on 0344 499 1000. But we're going to talk to a senior fellow at the Institute for Government next about these NHS and civil service changes.
Across the UK. On DAB+. On your smart speaker. On your smart TV. And on your side. This is Talk.
Good evening, this is Talk Drive. I'm Peter Cardwell. Thank you so much for your company. I'm here between now and 7, and then Kevin O'Sullivan takes over between 7 and 10. Loads to discuss, including whether farmers should get subsidies. The farming minister says he thinks those are going to end by 2027. We will see whether that happens or not. What do you think? 0344 499 1000. Also, speaking of abolition, the Prime Minister has announced in Hull today that he is abolishing NHS England. He says the state is weaker than ever. He says it's flabby, though, and needs to be trimmed down, and it could be radically digitised, the civil service, using artificial intelligence in a bid to save £45 billion. Do you think he can do it? Should he do it? What about the 9,500 people from NHS England who could perhaps lose their jobs? An expert in the civil service and how it all works coming up next. We'll talk to her. We will also talk about those farming subsidies and anger as a school founded by a Nazi refugee has cancelled a talk by a Jewish writer. This is Jonathan Sacerdoti. We will get all the information on that from him. Free speech. We're the home of free speech. We're the home of common sense, and we make sure that whatever your view is, if it's within the law, you can broadcast it. 0344 499 1000 is the number to call. That's the number Linda called from London. I promise you we'll come back to her in about 10 minutes' time and get the rest of her story, so stay tuned for that. You can text me 87222 with the word talk in your text. You can tweet me at talkTV or follow me at Peter Cardwell. Send me a voice note, send me a WhatsApp text message, or give me a ring on 0344 499 1000. Lots to discuss between now and 7. Stay with us here on Talk. Thank you to Claire, who sent me a message on WhatsApp saying, "Hello Peter, always an informative and interesting show. Thank you. As far as the farmers and their plight, it's a double whammy. Starmer promised our farmers they would not have to endure the inheritance tax, and now they're losing their subsidies. I strongly believe farmers and their British heritage are hated by Labour, and it's a land grab for solar, wind and house building." Well, Keir Starmer's under a lot of pressure at the moment domestically. Internationally, it seems that many people think he's doing a good job in regard to Ukraine, but let me know if you disagree. Let's talk a little bit about what he's announced today. This is the NHS England body, the biggest quango in the world apparently, is being reduced, in fact is being abolished, and he says the state is weaker than ever. Well, the whole nature of how the government works, and indeed the civil service, well, there's a great expert on that, and her name is Jill Rudder, and she's a senior fellow at the Institute for Government, former civil servant herself. Jill, thank you for joining me this evening. Do you think that Keir Starmer can, as he puts it, tackle our flabby state? He can tackle it, but will it fall to the ground and will it yield to his tackling?
Interesting. I think undoubtedly the size of the state has expanded quite dramatically over the last decade or so. Really, what you could see is the numbers were being driven down under the Conservatives until the Brexit referendum. And since the Brexit referendum, numbers in the civil service have gone up a really, really long way, partly to cope with genuine new functions that the UK state had to take on as a result of Brexit, partly because the UK had to take on new sort of policy-making responsibilities, but then there was another big surge with COVID, and then we've seen big recruitment, even when the government said we're trying to drive numbers down to deal with things like the asylum backlog and things like that. So numbers have gone up. So I would think you would not find very many people say there isn't scope for reducing numbers. Really interesting that the first target for his reduction is NHS England, which was a creation of the coalition government. Remember those big reforms that Andrew Lansley, the Conservative Health Secretary, put through, very controversial at the time. And his whole idea was that this would enable the Department of Health to become a very sort of smaller strategic body, really looking after public health, and that politicians would stay a long way away from the day-to-day management of the health service. He'd write a letter once a year to tell NHS England, this is only England, what he wanted it to do. They get on and do it. He'd hold them accountable for whether they've done it or not within the resources. Ministers would step back from that sort of responsibility. Today, Wes Streeting saying, no, that's led to too many people doing the same jobs big explosion in bureaucracy. He's got some figures that says actually now there are twice as many people as there were when we left government as Labour in 2010. I can strip that way back. That's where this 10,000 number comes from. And I want to be personally accountable for whether the health service delivers or not. So that's quite a brave move by Mr. Streeting.
He also said a few months ago that he didn't want any top-down reorganisation of the NHS. And if this isn't top-down reorganisation, I don't know what is.
You're absolutely right. I mean, you sort of feel like, what was the line from Brenda from Bristol? Oh, God, not another one.
Yeah, not and another one?
So you do usually feel that actually politicians, when they become frustrated not being able to change outcomes in the NHS, change structures. And we've seen that too many times. We were promised by Andrew Lansley that his reorganisation would be the last one. But basically, because the divorcing of the NHS from politics was always a bit unrealistic, given how central the NHS is to our political debates. So even under his immediate successor, Jeremy Hunt, he basically took back quite a degree of political control while leaving the structures in place. Wes Streeting's now decided to get rid of them. And I think what we're probably seeing, and really interesting, is we've seen the departures over the last 10 days of a lot of really high-ranking people, the chief executive, the chief operating officer, the chief finance officer, the medical director of NHS England have all gone in the last few days. So I think there was clearly dissatisfaction with the performance of the top level of NHS England. Clearly, Wes Streeting was getting very frustrated. I think the thought was coming through that maybe they were a bit too complacent about the performance of the NHS and weren't moving at the pace he wanted. Though it has to be said, what's one of the reasons that people try to avoid big reorganisations is because those become a massive distraction.
Yeah, and they take a lot of time, and they take a lot of money, and they duplicate a lot of things, and they take, the actual setting up and the organisation takes a long time. Maybe AI will solve it all, Jill. Maybe artificial intelligence will mean that Keir Starmer can save £45 billion. Do you think that's realistic?
I'm very intrigued as to where this I've spent this afternoon, Peter, trying to find out where this 45 billion figure comes from, because it does sound like quite a big amount of money, and it is 45 billion a year. We've seen some quite tricksy presentations with the government where they've accumulated a number over quite a long time and got a big number, but this is 45 billion a year. And wherever you go, it keeps on saying analysis suggests. They're saying that the government's very under-digitised, doesn't perform anywhere near private sector benchmarks. There are lots of potential savings. How much of that 45 billion is actually in cash you can return to taxpayers or spend on other public services? Not clear to me. Some of it may be in the sort of reduced costs, so just making it easier for me as a citizen to deal with the state. That's worth having, but it doesn't convert into savings that the government can.
And that's a big question with all of this, isn't it, Jill? Because there may well be some money saved, there may well be changes, but to most people, NHS England didn't mean a huge amount, let's face it. To most people going to A&E, waiting for, I spoke to someone earlier in the programme, we waited for 11 hours recently, people, not getting a GP's appointment, etc. People saying, actually, what is this going to amount to? Because you can reorganise, but does it really make a difference? In your experience, Jill, will this make a difference to outcomes? Will this make a difference to people's experience of the NHS?
Very hard to tell. We'll have to see. We've been at this structure before with the Department of Health in charge. That was thought to be not working, which is why Andrew Lansley wanted these big reforms. I think it's fair to say those reforms haven't worked. Labour would say, well, when we had proper control in the Blair government in the 2000s or whatever, we did manage to drive things down, but they also threw a lot of money at the health service, and it's difficult to say it was the structures as opposed to the money. What we do know now is that Wes Streeting has put his head above the parapet and said, this is now down to me. And I've just listened to Wes Streeting on the radio saying, and Keir Starmer knows if I don't deliver, he has to come and sack me. So we know who to hold accountable for this. He can't say, it's those bureaucrats in NHS England. I think the real problem is, even if this really delivers better structure in the long run, is can he manage, does he have a plan now, and the people now, to manage through the disruption that this is going to cause and actually deliver those targets quickly? Because he's got that big milestone, maybe a millstone to deliver by 2028. And you're absolutely right. Nobody, apart from the people whose jobs are affected, a lot of people who'll be quite worried today, and we've got lots of comments on a call I did earlier from people saying, hasn't this been appallingly badly managed, etc., etc. People weren't given notice, things like that. But what everybody else cares about at the end of the day is the NHS performing better, and actually is it not absorbing money at such a rate that we can actually have better performing schools, deal with those backlogs in the criminal justice system, etc., etc., as well? Because at the moment, an increasing share of our GDP is being absorbed by the NHS. We know we're going to have to up defence spending, up other areas, and we can't have massive squeezes on all those so-called unprotected departments. So if the government can deliver these efficiencies, can deliver its target, well, I think we all have to hope that they can.
Thank you. Jill Rudder there, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government, with her analysis there. Thanks to Andy as well. He says the government says scrapping NHS England with the 16,000 staff will save £190 million. But that money will just move to the Department of Health and Social Care, which only has 1,500 employees. So 16,000 staff will just be rebranded as DHSC employees. It's a PR stunt. They'll spend billions on consultants to merge the two departments, only to end up with the same people and the same filling system. No real change for patients or the NHS. Yet another PR con job by Labour. Well, Andy, they are saying that 9,500 people will lose their jobs. We'll see if that happens. We'll hold their feet to the fire if that doesn't happen. If they say it's going to happen and it doesn't, they've changed their minds certainly on top-down reorganisation. But there we are. Listen, thank you for your thoughts there, Andy. Let's go back to Linda. We were speaking to Linda about 15 minutes ago. Linda, you were cruelly cut off in your prime by the news, but you were telling us about your husband who receives the personal independence payment and why you think that shouldn't be touched. Just continue your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so it's extra costs of being disabled that people wouldn't necessarily think about. So like you mentioned, hot water. Some people with some disabilities might need to use the washing machine a lot more. Things like having to get taxis rather than public transport, because, again, we live in London, only 40% of the tube network is accessible. Things like also, so we're not on any other means tested benefit. We're only getting the PIP because of savings. So if his PIP was to be removed, his quality of life and therefore health will diminish and will cost more money. So, for example, he pays at the moment out of his PIP to go once a week to a physio-led exercise class where it's safe for him to exercise. If the PIP was removed, we couldn't afford for him to do that. He goes to table tennis, an adapted lesson once a week, which again keeps the little bit of mobility that he's got. We couldn't afford that. Things like he's got a breathing machine that needs constantly plugging in, constantly charging. So I just think that there's a lot of confusion. I'm hearing a lot of people when they're talking about PIP saying that people should work. PIP is completely different.
And that's really interesting to hear that. I mean, it's actually George Osborne, when he was the Chancellor, even in the days of austerity, he didn't touch PIP. It went up in regard to inflation at all times. So these are tricky decisions that Labour is going to make. What is your message to the Work and Pensions Secretary, the Welfare Secretary, Liz Kendall? What would you say to her and to Keir Starmer in regard to all of this?
I think ultimately they need to actually genuinely be talking to disabled people. And also the other thing I think is that with PIP, so on the face value of it, some of the reforms don't look too bad. So one of them, for example, is that you will no longer be able to apply for PIP if you don't have an official diagnosis of your condition. That sounds reasonable, right? Until you realise that for a lot of medical conditions, the average wait for a diagnosis on the NHS, including physical conditions, is about 2 years.
To say nothing of the fact, I mean, I've mentioned this before on the air, my best friend has multiple sclerosis. She basically had it for 15 years before, 10, 15 years before it was diagnosed. And there are a lot of things she couldn't do. She couldn't work, she couldn't do a lot of different things before that time. So actually, those changes, as you say, on paper, they look okay, but actually for many people, it's debilitating. It's very, very difficult. I'm sure that a lot of people are very stressed at the moment. Are you and your husband worried about this, Linda?
We're not too worried. The reason being is because normally these changes are for new claimants. And now I'm not against some of the reform. Again, I think, for example, at the moment, most of the increase is in young people between the age of 18 and 24, and most of it is for mental health conditions. What we need to be looking at is, rather than giving them money because they're disabled, is actually investing in mental health services, because there's no support. So it's all well and good cutting the finances, but there's no support available.
Linda, great call. I'm sorry it was over 2 separate occasions, but I really, really appreciate it, Linda. I wish you and your husband well. That's Linda in London. Give me a ring anytime, Linda. You have a lot of very interesting things and very important things, I think, to say as well. Thank you to Sharon, who sent me a message on WhatsApp as well. He says, I agree, we need to do all in our power to stand with our farmers from this government who are, for some crazy reason, out to get them. The wrong argument is being made by some who say farmers should pay their share like the rest of us. How about no one should be paying inheritance tax on something their families have been taxed to death on multiple times over already? We need food security, so we must back our farmers. Thank you, says Sharon. Well, thank you, Sharon. And actually, we're going to talk about this next here on Talk. We're going to have a bit of a debate about it. I want your thoughts as well. 0344 499 1000. In fact, we're speaking to the former farming minister in just a second.
A lot of people are suckered in by the label on the tin that might say hate. We're cracking down on hate or racism or sexism, and they don't actually open up that tin to see what that label actually is covering. So, for example, is mispronouncing somebody's name hate and racism, or is it just an innocent mistake? Well, again, these are the kinds of subtleties that those police officers will miss because they just buy whatever it is that is in the name of that label.
Yeah.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Bob's been in touch on the farming question and says, I assume removing farmer subsidies will make them more vulnerable to exploitation by supermarkets or possibly lead to food inflation. As well as that, it means this rubbish government will waste money elsewhere. Well, what do you think about this? 0344 499 1000. Let's speak to Sir Mark Spencer. He's the former Conservative Farming Minister. He's a farmer himself. Mark, thanks for joining us this evening here on Talk. Some people might say that actually farmers having around 40% of their income given to them as a subsidy is actually something that shouldn't happen and the taxpayers shouldn't be paying for. What would you say to that argument?
So I would say, I mean, that's fine, but of course then food prices would go through the roof. We'd see a disaster in terms of our security as a nation of food production. And I think actually when you look at what farmers are doing now, not only are they producing great quality food, but they're also managing our environment, our biodiversity, and they're working, or were working, with government to try and make sure the beautiful countryside that we hold so dear remains as beautiful as it always has, and is improved and enhanced along with the wildlife that lives there as well as the farmers.
Tell us what's been happening since Brexit, because these subsidies used to come from the EU. Obviously, we paid a huge amount of money to the EU and we're getting that back essentially. But what has been happening since then, including when you were farming minister? Because the subsidies, have they just been coming out of general taxation then?
Yeah, so basically farmers were paid an amount per acre. So the more land you had, the more money you received. And we as a government, the previous government, when we were in charge, devised a system whereby farmers were rewarded for the public good that they did. So not only the great food that they produce, but also the environmental improvements that they make, the biodiversity changes that they were delivering. And so that we were moving in a direction that was much more sustainable, much more beneficial to the environment, and of course helped with our fight against climate change, helped with food security. And I think that was the right direction to be going in. And this appears to be a sort of pulling up of the drawbridge of that process. And I mean, it almost feels like a scorched earth policy, frankly, that the Labour government has written off the countryside now. It knows it's not going to get any votes from the countryside, and those Labour MPs that find themselves representing rural areas are just going to be cut loose and be told, thanks very much for your service, but we won't be needing you after the next general election.
I just wonder, Mark, why you think, I mean, you've made your points there saying that Labour doesn't understand the countryside, Labour doesn't like the countryside, but I mean, from a really straightforward food security perspective, why do this?
Why cut the?
Yeah, why cut the subsidy? It just doesn't seem.
I can't work it out.
You can make political points, and you're very welcome to do so, Mark, as our Labour, if they want to come on and you know, you've made your political points. But from a logical sort of actual food on the table, keeping food at a reasonable price, keeping an industry going, which is a very important industry in the UK. I mean, what do you think their thinking is? What do you think they think?
I mean, I cannot begin to work it out, because without that financial security within rural businesses, those farmers will vote with their feet. They will look to other sources of income, other diversifications. That may well be solar energy or wind energy. It may well be a complete diversification into equestrianism or non-food production, basically, and the use of that land for non-food production, which is a disaster for us as a United Kingdom, because we need those farmers there producing that great quality food, but also we need the next generation to come and get involved. So right at the moment where we need the next bright and sort of, you know, exciting generation to come and get stuck in to solve climate change, to keep us well fed, to improve biodiversity, we're actually saying to that generation, we don't really want you to come and get involved. Go and do something else with your life. Go and do another career. And that is a disaster. That is a brain drain away from food production in the UK, and one which we will struggle to recover from if we allow it to happen.
Mark, thank you. Appreciate that. That's Mark Spencer there, Sir Mark Spencer, who's the former farming minister for the Conservatives. He's a farmer himself, and very, very interesting thoughts there. I want to talk to a farmer, Ollie Fletcher, who's a farmer in Leicestershire. We're going to talk to Julian Jessup, who's an economics fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs, in a second. This is because Daniel Zeichner, who is the farming minister, he has said that all farming subsidies could stop. This could be as soon as 2027, 2 years from now. The money did come from the EU, although of course we paid a lot into the EU previously. Now we know that the farming minister says it could happen in 2 years' time. The inheritance tax row, of course, is a big one farmers are grappling with as well and continue to do so. Ollie, thank you for joining us from Leicestershire. Ollie has a farm. Tell us a bit about your farm, Ollie. How many animals are on there and how many acres do you have?
Well, we have 120 acres. We're formerly dairy. We gave up, unfortunately, after Brexit. We used to milk about 100 cows or so, and we're arable now. And I've invested in some sheep to manage the grassland.
And what would losing your subsidy mean for you?
Well, us personally have been affected by this, actually, because of a bureaucratic error on DEFRA's end, whereby some of our land was rejected because they'd got the maths wrong on the amount of land in a tract. So we have lost out on this. But it's not really about us as businesses. It's about the welfare of the nation as a whole, as you were just discussing with Mark Spencer. After the war, we got these subsidies not for farmers, but for the whole population to provide cheap food for the people. And they were given to us by the Labour Party, and they are now being removed just as our food security is being called into question by, the very real possibility of the European food that we rely on. We get about 30% of our food from Europe being dragged into a conflict. So I would encourage all of your listeners to think very carefully about where their food comes from, the health standard of food that they consume, and also the environment. If these are things that people care about, they need to get in touch with their MPs because it's under threat.
Julian Jessup is an economics fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Julian, what do you make of what you've heard here?
Yeah. Well, I think when you're talking about spending taxpayers' money on something, you need to have a clear reason why. And frankly, I don't actually think growing food is a good enough reason, because there is a market for food already. If people want to buy British food, they can. There isn't any obvious market failure there. Where I'm more sympathetic, though, is the idea of these sort of wider economic benefits. So, for example, what economists call externalities in the environment. So if we have lots of attractive farms, then that's good for the local community in all sorts of different ways. So there might be a case for subsidising farmers who contribute to the environment or perhaps manage natural habitats better. So, for example, farmers who provide hedgerows that are important for wildlife, those sorts of things. But the simple activity of providing food, I think, is something that can be left to the market with no need for the taxpayer to chip in.
The market will sort this out, Ollie?
No, I don't agree. I'm not an economist, I'm a historian, but I would argue that there is an almost intrinsic market failure, certainly within sectors like dairy, because you have an enormous purchasing power of the processing and retail companies, and then lots of small people, like in my own family, who produce a homogenous good. So we don't get to set the price, which means that any efficiency we possibly have gets squeezed out of us by the supermarkets, and any subsidy we receive often gets squeezed out of us as well, which means we become very, very efficient, but are not very profitable because the money is being made higher up the food chain where people have more power. And that is why we need the government to intervene in this sector to protect us from the purchasing power of these big corporations that would just destroy us if allowed to do so. And I fear that's where the Labour Party are heading with this.
Julian?
Well, the flip side of that, of course, is that people in the shops pay lower prices than they would otherwise have done. As far as the farming industry as a whole is concerned, it may well be that there are lots of smaller farms that, frankly, are not profitable if the market is allowed to operate normally. And I have to sort of ask the question, so what? I know it's a terribly difficult thing to say, and I'd be reluctant to say it necessarily face-to-face to a farmer in a pub. But at the end of the day, if the business is uneconomic, then maybe people should think of doing something else. Now, it may well be, of course, that they've got limited opportunities because, for example, planning restrictions prevent them from using the land for other things. But I think that's a problem in the planning system. If at the end of the day, a small farm is not profitable because the market is not willing to pay the going rate for the goods that they're going to produce, then I think somebody has to do something else instead.
Ollie, what do you make of that? You've got a skeptical expression on your face.
It's the crucial difference here is between profitability and efficiency. I completely concede that most farms are not profitable, but that doesn't mean they're not efficient, and that doesn't mean that what they provide isn't very valuable to the nation. I would argue exceeding its market value, and therefore has positive externalities in facilitating health within the working population. So I do take the point that farms are not profitable, but I think the Labour Party are thinking along the lines that you are, and are taking a lack of profitability to mean inefficiency, and they're trying to cut the fat off the bone of the countryside, but there is no fat there, and it will fall apart.
Julian, is it weird for you to be on the same side as Daniel Zeichner, the farming minister?
Well, no, I never take political positions, and if the government says something sensible, then I will support them, whether they are necessarily a party I would vote for or not.
Sure.
I will say though that I do have some concerns. I think there's a lack of detail here about exactly what the government is planning, and in particular, it feels very rushed. It feels like they're casting around for a few billion here or there. Ahead of the spending review, because the broader economic strategy is failing. So last year's October budget has clearly backfired. It's weakened the economy. It's actually undermined the public finances. So I am worried that the government is looking at pots of money it might find from somewhere, and it could just be picking on farmers. So I would still like to see a lot more detail about which subsidies they're looking at and planning to cut, and exactly what the rationale is for getting rid of them.
Thank you both very much. Julian Jessup there, an economics fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and Ollie Fletcher, who's a farmer in Leicestershire. Appreciate their contributions. Let me know what you think about this. 0344 499 1000. We will return to this story. We'll take a lot more calls between now and 7. But I want to talk in just a second about an elite school that was founded by a refugee from Nazi Germany. It sparked anger. It has cancelled the invitation of a Jewish commentator to speak to pupils. This was Jonathan Sacerdoti. He's been on the show before. He's contributed to talk. He was due to talk about journalism and anti-Semitism in South Wales last Sunday. But the school, which educates pupils between 16 and 18, sixth formers essentially from around the world, made a U-turn on Friday after a group of pupils complained his presence would be, quote unquote, distressing. Well, even if something's distressing, does that mean that free speech should be stopped? Well, we have a statement from the school. I'll read that out, and I'll talk to Jonathan in just a second.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Thanks to Fiona, who's been in touch. She says, this is the question everybody should be firing at every Labour MP. Without our farmers, who's feeding the nation? Over and over and over. Mary says, communists hate the family and private property. Is it a surprise that Starmer is attacking family-based farms? Mary, I think Keir Starmer's many things. I don't think that he is a communist. But listen, maybe you disagree with me. That's okay. We're going to take a load of calls between now and 7 o'clock. You can give me a ring to get on that list. 0344 499 1000. But for the meantime, I just want to talk to Jonathan Sacerdoti, who's a journalist and broadcaster. He's been on the show many times, been on my weekend shows as well. You know, I'm on from 10 o'clock on Saturday and Sunday mornings, and Jonathan's joined me on that. And unsurprisingly, Jonathan, who's a very well-established and senior journalist, was asked by an elite school, actually founded by a refugee from Nazi Germany. They invited him to talk to pupils. This is UWC Atlantic. It's a very prestigious school. A friend of mine, a daughter of a friend of mine actually went to it. Jonathan was invited and then cancelled. Jonathan, talk us through this. What happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it's a rite of passage as a journalist these days to be cancelled for something, but I didn't expect a school set up by a German refugee from Nazi Germany to be the one to cancel me, a Jew, the son of a Holocaust survivor, due to go there and speak about anti-Semitism to the children. So that was the shock. And it was also shock because after I'd been invited, I had several long conversations, meetings on Zoom with the school facilitators about the requirements for the children there, and that some of them were emotionally connected to the topics I was talking about, and so they wanted to make sure that I could be sensitive and accommodating of their needs. And I made clear all the way through that absolutely I would be. You know, I've spoken in schools before. I'm used to speaking to young people. I'm used to speaking to adults. It's part of the nature of the work that I do. So I was shocked when eventually they came back and said that after they had publicised that I was going to be there, they had some problems with some of the students who they felt would have an emotional reaction, that would feel endangered, that my presence would be somehow threatening to them.
Endangered, threatening. I mean, these are just ludicrous terms. You are someone who speaks very passionately, but very logically and very straightforwardly. I mean, this is just nonsense.
Well, I think it's nonsense, and I think it's worse than nonsense. I think that to make these sorts of concessions in the face of people who maybe demanded that I shouldn't be there because they disagree with me is to give in, and it's to go against all the true ideals of that school or any school, or at least the ideals as they should be.
I mean, surely when you're in sixth form, the idea is that you expand your mind, you concentrate on a smaller number of subjects, you have critical thinking, you start to have disagreements and arguments with your teachers and so on. I'm not saying that I don't want anybody to be emotionally distressed, but I don't think you would have done that anyway, and as you say, you would have been sensitive to this. But simply because there were objections from the students, I mean, surely a true leader of a school would say, I note your objections, but actually you can either not attend this, or you can attend and then put up your hand at the end and ask a challenging question.
Absolutely. And the fact is that this was an extracurricular activity that I think some students had requested because they felt that after 17 months or so of activities relating to the war in Israel and Gaza, they felt that their perspective had been underrepresented, some of them Jewish or Israeli, because it's a school made up of an international student body. Some of them are royalty from Spain and some of them are refugees from the Middle East. So there's a wide mix, a broad mix of people there, and the whole aim of that school, as I understand it, their ethos, is to try and create world citizens who can listen to one another and who can strive for a world of coexistence and peace. But if you hide the mainstream perspective that I was there to represent of some of those people, if you try and silence the voice of Jews or people who are talking about anti-Semitism since October the 7th, it's at a world peak in my lifetime. If you silence those people, or you tell them they can't be there, or they can only be there in a pre-recorded video, they can't see the room.
That was the option they gave you, wasn't it? A pre-recorded video, which they could presumably vet and see what you had to say and say, actually, is this going to upset people?
Yeah, well, quite. And I mean, that doesn't encourage or foster discussion or understanding of anything. And I would say that given that they emphasised to me how important it was that I should adapt how I spoke or what I said to the people in the room and their reaction, to then remove my ability to do that by insisting that I could only submit a pre-recorded video was ridiculous. I had committed to spending 8 hours travelling from London to South Wales in that one day in order to be there and to speak speak with the children, and I often will go and speak to schools or universities or just about anywhere that has a genuine interest in hearing what I have to say and what I represent, because I think that's a fundamental part of education and persuasion and analytical, critical thinking that is perhaps lacking in some places these days. So given that that was the case, to tell me that I could only do a pre-vetted speech by video was absurd, especially as if they want to watch videos of me, I have a
there are plenty of those
thriving YouTube channel.
Yeah, they can go on the app here and see what you have to say there. A spokesperson, I'll say spokesman because I hate the phrase spokesperson, spokesman for UWC Atlantic, this is the school, said at UWC Atlantic, the safety and well-being of our students remain our highest priority. As an international college with children aged 16 to 18 from diverse backgrounds, including those who have direct experience of conflict and trauma, we have a deep responsibility to ensure all discussions are conducted with sensitivity. The college regularly hosts events and workshops with internal and external speakers to provide a wide range of perspectives on world affairs. These are designed to foster constructive dialogue, utilising mutual respect, critical thinking and peace building. We explored alternative formats to ensure that discussions could take place while upholding our safeguarding responsibilities. Unfortunately, Mr. Sacerdoti declined these options and we were unable to find a mutually agreeable way forward. UWC Atlantic remains committed to fostering open and meaningful discussions that enhance our students' understanding of important world issues. What do you make of that, Jonathan?
Well, there was one option, I did say, I'm perfectly clear about that. It was to send a pre-recorded video with pre-recorded answers to pre-vetted questions. I did decline that, they're right. This is a handy way of saying they didn't cancel me, but they did cancel what was originally suggested, which is that I would be there and engage in an open and sensitive discussion with the children, which I was fully committed to doing. I think I demonstrated that in the hours of conversations that I had with them beforehand, listening to all the concerns and committing myself explicitly to doing that. So I think it's doubly dishonest to say that they offered me options that I refused. There was one option only, and I think that most people listening to this will know that that doesn't sound like a very reasonable option to try and
what do you draw from this, Jonathan? What's the impression that is left, apart from the fact that you've been treated very rudely, I think, by this school? But given the nature of what you were likely to say, I think there are conclusions that people will automatically draw from that.
I don't really feel too bad personally about it. It's not I'm not asking for sympathy. I feel much worse for the children who had requested that somebody like me or that I should be there in order to try to counter what they perhaps had sensed was a message that had been relentingly one-sided for the last 17 months. I feel sorry for those children. I feel sorry for all of the children there who don't get to broaden their perspectives by hearing opinions and thoughts and analysis that they might not agree with instinctively. They might not agree with even once they've heard it. So I feel more sorry for the children. I would say that the adults responsible for them have failed them in that respect, out of perhaps, if we read them at face value, an over cautious sense of looking after their emotional well-being. If that was the intention, I think that has got in the way of their broader education and their broader exposure to critical thinking and different ideas and different positions, which is all I was there to represent. Yeah. We discussed at length that that's what I would do. So I think that is a failing of that school, and I'm afraid so. I think it's probably happening up and down the country and other schools and universities as well. That's why I'm speaking out about it, not out of any sense of wanting revenge or to make anybody feel bad, but because I think it's really important that when these things do happen, we should call them out and speak out. And as a Jewish person, it's happening over and over again to people in my community, to other Jewish people. So I'm very pleased to have a platform to express my disappointment and disgust with being cancelled in that regard, on behalf of all the Jewish people who are afraid to do so.
Well, this is one platform from which you will never be cancelled. Jonathan, thank you. Jonathan Sacerdoti there, journalist and broadcaster. Lots to discuss in that and lots of other different aspects of what we're talking about today. There are people who want to talk about NHS England, about David Lammy, about Donald Trump and about the Chagos Islands as well. Lots of different comments coming in, including from Dawn in Chelmsford. He says, in view of the incompetence demonstrated by this Labour government, we can hardly have confidence that directly managing the NHS will be successful. On farmers as well, a big topic people want to talk about today. Kelvin says this government doesn't like farmers. They don't earn that much money. If they earn £12 an hour, they are lucky. Also, this government cutting benefits for the sick and disabled and forcing them to work. I know a lot of people are jumping with joy, but none of those people know how a disabled person feels. They don't know what pain and suffering they're going through all day, every day, so quick to judge us. I hope they all end up with some sort of disability and then they might realise it's no fun, says Kelvin. The only winners are the migrants. How many migrants' benefits have been cut or stopped? Not one. Claire says, I'm disgusted hearing Linda talking about her husband losing his PIP. Something has to give, but all of us in this country are losing out and paying extra taxes to keep illegals comfortable in our country. Well, we'll see what happens with the personal independence payment. I think it's going to be a very, very big topic politically over the next few weeks. And on Atlantic College, sadly, Lorraine says, sadly, the refusal of the Welsh private school to allow a Jewish speaker to attend just shows how spineless the leadership is. It is yet another example of a certain minority silencing free speech. This is an international school and its statement is just hypocritical. There was no safeguarding issue. The school clearly doesn't foster a culture of understanding and peaceful discussion and debate. It is dishonest censorship. Well, we will have lots more on all the topics we're talking about today. We're going to take a load of your calls right up until 7 o'clock when Kevin O'Sullivan will be here between 7 and 10. So stay with us here on Talk.
People are suckered in by the label on the tin that might say hate. We're cracking down on hate or racism or sexism, and they don't actually open up that tin to see what that label actually is covering. So, for example, is mispronouncing somebody's name hate and racism, or is it just an innocent mistake? Well, again, these are the kinds of subtleties that those police officers will miss because they just buy whatever it is that is in the name of that label.
Yeah.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Lots of people getting in touch on farming. Jay says farming and food production is a sovereign industry and has to remain a significant percentage of the consumption of the population. That these talking head economists don't get that utterly mystifies me. Thank you for that. Another person says PIP is a strange benefit, personal independence payment. Not sure why disabled people should be given extra money just to indulge in hobbies and take taxis, etc. Well, there are extra costs associated with being disabled. We did talk about that a little bit earlier on, such as if you want to get out and about, you should be able to get a taxi. I'm happy that my taxpayers' money goes to disabled people to be able to do that. I'd rather they get out and about because their health is going to decline if they're cooped up all day. That's not a healthy thing. Angie Hudson's been in touch and says, very good interview with Peter Cardwell earlier on with Andrew Fox. Please be on again and keep people informed of the situation in Syria. Very interesting to hear from Andrew there, and we will absolutely bring you more on that as time goes on. Diana says, thank you for covering Syria, Peter. The people and media most likely to be covering it are from Israel. They, of course, are looking after their common border. Glyn says, dear Mr. Cardwell, Starmer not a communist? What is the difference between socialism and communism? They're both of the authoritarian left. There is a difference between socialism and communism, believe me, and it would take me a bit longer than the 8 minutes I have left to explain it properly, but I just don't believe that. I don't even really think he's a socialist, Keir Starmer. I mean, he's getting rid of a load of jobs, for example. He certainly believes in a socialised NHS, but then most people in this country do. I mean, I used to be a member of the Conservative Party. I'm not anymore, haven't been for years, but I mean, I believe in socialised medicine. I believe in basically socialism for schools, for example. I think schools should be palaces and given loads of money, and teachers should be far more highly paid than they are, if they're any good, and should be performance related. Sue says, Linda has only one side of the story. This is our caller earlier on personal independence payments. The problem with personal independence payments is that it's going to mental health issues, and for many it's a scam. They just have to mention suicidal thoughts and they're awarded the payment. Nobody is going to take PIP from genuine cases, says Suze. Malcolm in Southampton says, those like myself who grew up in the 50s and 60s will remembering the harrowing black and white TV images of skeletal Jewish men, women and children being shoveled into pits for one reason only, simply being Jewish, says Malcolm. And certainly anti-Semitism is a huge problem, and it's become bigger since the 7th of October Hamas terrorist attacks. Absolutely. Let's talk about Donald Trump. Janice has given me a ring from Clacton-on-Sea. Janice, your MP, Nigel Farage, big fan of Donald Trump. Are you?
Hi, nice to speak to you. I haven't spoken to you for a long while. Thank you.
Good to talk to you, Janice.
Right, Nigel Farage, Trump 2, right?
Okay, Trump 2, Trump 2.0.
I've been, sorry.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
2.0. I've been listening to Trump the last couple of days. I'm not sure if I admire him or I'm scared of him. He wants to annex countries. That's no different to what Putin's done. He took Crimea, he took the Donbass, and he's tried to take Odessa. So I am a bit confused there.
He's taken them by force, though, Janice.
He's got Starmer, Trump free.
He's had. I mean, the thing with Trump. I mean, he talks about Greenland and Canada.
He's going to take it.
But he's not saying he's going to take them by force.
Well, he won't have to, because he's absolutely. With tariffs, and if we're not careful, if Starmer doesn't walk away from EU, we'll be joining him. He is a man on a mission. I am absolutely, well, to a degree I'm scared of him, but I think in a way he's a genius.
Interesting. Well, I think there is some level of genius in there, certainly. Janice, thank you. That's Janice in Clacton-on-Sea. Gemma's in Staffordshire and wants to talk about the NHS. Gemma, you're very welcome to the programme. What would you like to say?
Hi. I had a shortish, which turned out to be longer than expected, conversation with somebody in their 70s earlier who misheard the radio and thought that the NHS was being abolished today.
Right, yes,
so
it's not.
I'm concerned, I know, that the elder generation, the people with special needs, would be the PIP kind of applicants, some of them, might get the wrong end of the stick and forgotten what a Quango is. Am I right? It's a Quango.
It is a Quango, yes. Do you know what Quango stands for, Gemma?
No, I've got no idea.
Gemma, shall I shoehorn some useless information into you?
Go for it.
It stands for Quasi-Autonomous Non-Governmental Organisation. And now we know that NHS that was a Quango is Quangone.
Right, very good.
Thank you.
I'm scared of Donald Trump as well.
Why are you scared of him?
Because I think he says things without thinking. And for somebody who's in charge of the free world, that's not very clever.
Although Nigel Farage says, it's an interesting one, Gemma, because Nigel Farage says that we should take Trump what is it? Seriously, but not literally. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that's a bit kind. You know, he's the president of America.
Yes.
He's not like some bloke down the pub, you know, who sort of talks a bit load of rubbish and you've got to work out what's sort of sensible and what isn't. He's in charge of America.
Yes.
So he hasn't got that excuse. He might as well apply for PIP if that's how bad. If that's what we've all got to do, is work out which bits are literal or which bits are exaggeration.
Yeah.
And he deserves £76 a week.
Well, it's really interesting, actually. Downing Street said recently, their press operation said that they wouldn't be responding to things that Donald Trump said in media interviews. And that's fair enough. But, I mean, a lot of the way he gets his words out and the way he gets his policy out is through media interviews, particularly with places like Fox News. So, I mean, if you're not going to respond to that, what are you going to respond to? And it's interesting because Donald Trump is a very different character in many, many ways, but he's shaking up not just what he says, but also how people respond to it as well.
Yes, and I mean, that's fair enough. That is a way of leading something. But I don't believe it's the way of leading America. And I say that out of concern for all Americans.
Yeah.
Whether they're Democrats, Republicans, or quite frankly, anarchists, it doesn't matter. You have to have somebody in charge who is able to say things as they mean them.
Yeah. OK, well, Gemma, thanks. Lots of different thoughts there. Gemma in Staffordshire. Georgina in London, you're our last caller today. What would you like to say?
Hi. I'd just like to say that, you know, Trump is a businessman. He's not a conventional politician. Now, when he and Putin met, they sat down and they chatted, and Trump was very pleasant to him and made him very welcome. And I think there was method in his madness there by putting Putin in a false sense of security to find out exactly what Putin was ready to deal with. Trump needed to know exactly what Putin wanted. And he got all the information he wanted, and Putin went on his way. Now, Trump has had time to think now about what he can do that's going to benefit Zelensky. He's a very clever man. He is not Putin's friend. He's in it.
And do you believe Trump, Georgina, when he says that he would wreck Russia's economy? Because some people think that's an empty threat. I wonder what you think.
Well, I think don't underestimate the power of the Trump, because this man, let me tell you, everything he has promised the people of America, he has tried his very best to follow through and do. You know, he tries his best to do it, and I do think that now with the Ukraine